Consider the psychological weight of that moment. John White was not just a governor. He was an artist. He was a man trained to see detail, to notice the subtle shift of light on a leaf, the expression in a human eye. As he stood before that carved post, he began to realize that the silence of Roanoke was a manufactured silence. He walked further into the center of what used to be the village. He found the spot where his daughter's house had stood. The earth there was disturbed, but not by the feet of many people. It was a single, deep, rectangular depression, exactly the size of a shipping crate used by the British Royal Navy. Ask yourself, why would a colony of starving settlers, supposedly fleeing for their lives, take the time to carefully disassemble their homes and leave the site as clean as a cathedral floor? Why would they carry away the heavy, useless timber but leave behind nothing of their personal lives? As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sand, White's men began to uncover the first dark clues. Underneath a thick layer of pine needles, one of the sailors kicked something hard. It was a chest. One of John White's own chests, which he had buried before leaving for England. It had been dug up, ransacked, and thrown aside. His books were ruined by the rain, his maps torn, but it wasn't what was taken that chilled him. It was what was left behind, inside the broken chest. Resting atop a pile of rotting parchment was a small ivory carving of a rose, the Tudor rose. It was stained with a dark, brownish residue that did not look like mud. It looked like ancient, dried iron, blood that had been preserved through a process. The common man of the 16th century could not possibly understand Dot at this moment. The informative truth begins to bleed through the myth. During the reign of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the royal court was obsessed with the concept of prima materia, the first matter. The queen was aging. Her teeth were blackening, her skin was fading, and the pressure to remain an immortal icon of England was crushing her. She had invested a fortune into the studies of John Dee, the royal astrologer and alchemist. Dee's journals, hidden now in the deepest vaults of the British Library, speak of a new world bloodline, a theory that the untouched soil of the Americas, combined with the vitality of the first generation born there, could create a tincture of life. White looked around the empty clearing. He realized that the 115 people who had been here weren't just colonists. They were a biological experiment. They were the first generation, and they were missing because they had been called in. The wind began to howl through the trees, a low, mourning sound that seemed to carry the voices of the lost. White's men wanted to leave. They felt a primal urge to return to the safety of the ships, to get away from this island that felt like an open grave. But White remained. He began to look at the trees surrounding the clearing. Not at the trunks, but at the roots. The soil around the great oaks had been turned recently. Not by shovels, but by something that moved with systematic intent. He began to dig with his bare hands, the salt-cracked skin of his fingers screaming as he pushed into the dirt. 6 inches down, he found it. Not a body. Not a bone. He found a series of glass vials encased in lead. They were empty, but the interior of the glass was etched with the same crosshatch pattern he had seen on the Croatoan post. These were apothecary jars. Specifically, they were jars used for the transport of high-value biological agents. The realization began to dawn on him. A slow, cold sunrise of horror. The colony hadn't failed. The colony had been a harvest. The Croatoan tribe were not the captors. They were the guards. The word itself, when broken down into its alchemical roots in the cipher of John Dee, meant the gathering of the essence. The American audience of today is often told that Roanoke is a ghost story. But ghost stories are easy. They require no accountability. The reality of a government-sanctioned harvest of its own citizens is much harder to digest. It speaks to a moral decay that started at the very foundation of the English Empire. White stood up, his hands covered in the dark, rich soil of the New World. He looked toward the sea. He knew the ships were waiting, and he knew that if he told the truth, he would never reach the shores of England alive. The Crown did not tolerate witnesses to its hunger. To understand the depth of this betrayal, we must look closer at the men who organized the voyage. Sir Walter Raleigh, the flamboyant favorite of the Queen, was not a man of sentiment. He was a man of debt. His expeditions were funded by shadowy figures in the London banking circles who demanded a return on their investment that gold alone could not. Satisfied. In the late 1580s, the Spanish Armada was a looming shadow over England. The nation was bankrupt, and the Queen's health was failing. The Roanoke expedition was marketed to the public as a chance for a new life, a chance to spread the glory of the Protestant faith. But the passenger manifest tells a different story. Among the 115 settlers, there were an unusual number of physicians, herbalists, and apothecaries. There were men whose only job in London had been the preparation of corpses for the nobility. Why would a small farming colony need so many experts in the management of the dead? As John White paced the empty clearing of Roanoke that night, he remembered the faces of these men. He remembered how they would often take the children aside, measuring their height, recording the color of their eyes, and taking small samples of their hair. At the time, he thought it was merely the curiosity of men of science in a new land. Now, standing in the silence of their absence, he realized it was an inventory. He moved toward the perimeter of the village, where the forest began. The trees here were old, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the purple-black sky. He felt a presence. Not a ghost, but the feeling of being watched by something living, something patient. He found a small path leading toward the swampy interior of the island. On the ground, he noticed a trail of small white stones. They were arranged in a pattern that mirrored the constellation of Draco the Dragon, a symbol frequently used in alchemical text to represent the preservation of the life force. Every step he took away from the shore was a step deeper into a reality that defied the laws of the world he knew. He found a small clearing where the grass had been crushed down. In the center was a single chair carved from local cedar. Facing the east, on the seat of the chair was a pair of small leather shoes. They belonged to a child. They were perfectly clean, as if they had been placed there moments ago. But there were no footprints leading to or from the chair. The informative layer here is crucial. In the occult practices of the Elizabethan era, the gilded chair was a ritualistic setting for the extraction of what they called the aura of innocence. They believed that by placing a subject in a state of sensory deprivation at the exact moment of a celestial alignment, the very essence of their youth could be drawn out and captured. White picked up the shoes. He could still feel a faint warmth in the leather. He felt a scream building in his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief and terror. But he stayed silent. He knew that the forest had ears. He knew that the Croatoan were not just a tribe, but a specialized unit of the Queen's Guard, dressed in the skins of the New World. To blend into the shadows, he began to ask the questions that would haunt his journals for the rest of his life. questions that were eventually struck from the historical record by the censors of the Star Chamber. If the settlers had died of disease, where were the graves? If they had been killed in war, where was the destruction? If they had left willingly, why was the village unmade with such surgical precision? The only answer that remained was the one he was too afraid to voice. They were taken because they were successful. The experiment had worked. The New World blood had matured, and the crown had come to collect its prize. The moral decay of this act is staggering. To treat 100 loyal subjects as nothing more than cattle for a royal tincture is a stain on the history of the British Empire that can never be washed away. It reframes the entire concept of American colonization not as a search for freedom, but as a search for resources, where the most valuable resource was the human body itself. The night deepened. The stars above Roanoke seemed to burn with a cold, uncaring light. White knew he had to make a choice. He could stay and search for his family, losing himself in the dark heart of the island, or he could return to the ships and carry this secret back to a world that would never believe him. But as he turned to leave, he saw one final thing. Stuck into the bark of a tree at eye level was a small silver pin. It was in the shape of a hawk, the personal emblem of Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master. The pin was not rusted. It was bright. It was new. It was a message. A message that said, "We are still here. We are watching. And the harvest is not yet over." John White began to walk back toward the shore, but the path seemed longer than it had before. The trees seemed to lean in, their leaves whispering in a language that sounded like the dry rustle of old silk. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every snap of a twig in the distance felt like a gunshot. He reached the dunes and saw the flickering torches of his men. They were huddled together near the longboats, their faces pale in the firelight. They weren't looking at the village. They were looking at the water. "Governor," one of the men whispered, his voice trembling. "The sea. Look at the sea." The Atlantic, which had been rough and gray all day, was now as still as a sheet of black glass. But beneath the surface there was a glow. A soft, bioluminescent pulse that moved in rhythmic waves toward the shore. It wasn't the light of fish or algae. It was a structured light, a geometric pattern that mirrored the crosshatch carving on the Croatoan post. In the informative traditions of the 16th century seafaring lore, there were stories of the ghost fleets of the crown, ships that sailed without lanterns, moved by currents that didn't exist on any map. These were the vessels used for the black trade, the transport of items too sensitive for the eyes of the public or the church. White realized that the Hopewell was not the only ship in the Sound. There were others lurking just beyond the veil of the fog, waiting for him to leave. "We go now," White commanded, his voice cracking. "To the boats, now!" The men did not hesitate. They pushed the boats into the water, the oars splashing loudly in the unnatural silence. As they rowed back to the Hopewell, White looked back at the island one last time. The village site was no longer dark. A single, tall candle had been lit atop the Croatoan post. It burned with a steady blue flame that didn't flicker in the wind. Standing beside it was a figure in a long, dark cloak, their face obscured by a hood. The figure didn't move. They didn't wave. They simply stood there, a silent sentinel over the empty village, a guardian of the crown's secret. The psychological impact on the crew was immediate. By the time they climbed back onto the deck of the Hopewell, 2 of the men had descended into a state of catatonic shock. They spoke of the tall men with the glass eyes and the sound of the silver needle. John White retreated to his cabin. He took out his journal, the one where he had painted the beautiful watercolors of the New World, the plants, the animals, the people. He looked at his painting of a young woman from the Secondin tribe. He noticed, for the first time, a detail he had painted unconsciously, a small red mark behind her ear, the exact same shape as the silver hawkpin he had found in the woods. The conspiracy was larger than Roanoke. It was a web that spanned both sides of the ocean, a system of human management that treated the inhabitants of the New World and the settlers of the Old World as the same thing, raw material. He began to write, but his pen shook. He didn't write about the missing colony. He wrote about the harvested souls. He wrote about the queen's hunger and the alchemist's greed. But as he wrote, he heard a sound at his cabin door, a slow, rhythmic tapping, 3 short taps, 3 long. 3 short dot the distress signal, but it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the hull of the ship. From the outside, something was submerged in the water, clinging to the side of the vessel, communicating with him. He didn't open the window. He didn't call for help. He sat in the dark, watching the candle on his desk burn down to a stub. He realized that he would never be allowed to tell this story. He would be forced to lead other expeditions, to draw more maps, to lure more raw material to these shores. The lost colony was the perfect lie. It was a mystery that invited curiosity but discouraged investigation. It was a ghost story that kept people away from the truth, and the truth is this: the settlers of Roanoke did not die. They were transformed. They were taken into the deep dark of the English state. Their blood used to fuel the longevity of a dynasty that still sits on a throne today. As the Hopewell weighed anchor and began the long journey back to England, the fog swallowed Roanoke Island once again. The blue flame on the post went out. The island returned to its silent, holding breath state, but the dark clues remain. They are in the soil. They are in the bloodlines of the survivors. And they are in the word that we still can't quite explain. Croa to oa and it wasn't a place. It was a process. And it was only the beginning. But the mystery of the empty village was only the first layer of the deception. To truly understand why the crown was so desperate, we must look at the man who gave the orders from the shadows, a man whose maps contained locations that didn't exist on Earth. In our next section, we uncover the governor's forbidden orders. For 3 centuries, history has offered you a convenient excuse. They told you that John White, the governor of Roanoke, was a victim of circumstance. They said the Great Spanish Armada, the largest naval invasion in history, forced the Queen to seize every available ship, leaving the 115 settlers to rot in the American wilderness for 3 long years. It is a perfect story. It is a logical story, but it is a lie. The truth is preserved in the water-damaged ledgers of the High Court of Admiralty, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape that were never meant to be unraveled. John White did not stay away because of a war. He was stayed by a signature. While his daughter and granddaughter were supposedly starving, the ships he needed were sitting idle in the Thames, held back by a specific, forbidden command from the Queen's own spymaster. The delay was not a tragedy of timing. It was a calculated period of incubation. The Crown didn't want him to find the colony. They wanted the transformation to finish before he arrived. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold, damp fog of a London winter in 1587. The city is a labyrinth of timber-framed houses and muddy alleys, where the air is thick with the smell of coal smoke and the whispers of 1,000 secrets. Allow your body to settle into the stillness of the night. Feel the weight of your limbs as we step into the private study of a man whose heart is breaking, unaware that he is being played like a pawn on a board made of gold and bone. John White arrived in England in November of 1587. Desperate and driven by the memory of a crying child left on a distant shore. He had the funding, he had the ships, he had the will, but the moment his boots touched the London docks, he stepped into a web of invisible silk. History tells us that Sir Walter Raleigh, the great explorer, was the one who managed the Roanoke project. But the archival records show a different hand at the wheel. Every request White made for a relief expedition was intercepted, not by the Navy, but by the Secretary of the Shadows, Sir Francis Walsingham. Consider the logistical reality of 1588. While the Spanish Armada was indeed a threat, England possessed hundreds of smaller vessels that were entirely unsuitable for naval combat. White had secured 2 such ships, the Brave and the Roe. They were small, fast, and agile. They were not warships. They would have been useless against the Spanish galleon. Yet the order came down, no ship shall leave the English coast. Ask yourself, why would a nation at war forbid a small private supply run that posed no threat to the military effort? The answer lies in the forbidden orders found in the private papers of the Cecils, the Queen's most trusted advisers. The order was not to protect the ships from the Spanish. The order was to ensure that the Roanoke settlers remained isolated. In the language of the court, it was called the period of isolation. In the language of the alchemists who advised the Queen, it was called the negredo, the blackening. The first stage of a transmutation. White spent months in the halls of power, begging for an audience that would never come. He was watched by men in dark liveries, men who recorded every person he spoke to, every letter he wrote. He was a prisoner in his own city, a governor without a colony, a father without a family. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine the silence of his room at night, the only sound being the scratching of his own pen as he tried to make sense of the delays. He began to notice that his letters to his daughter Eleanor were being returned to him, not because they couldn't be delivered, but because they had been opened, read, and resealed with a wax that bore no crest. This was the beginning of the John White deception, a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed to keep a man compliant while his world was being erased. To understand the scale of the lie, we must look at the stay of shipping issued on April 9, 1588. On paper, it was a general embargo. In practice, it was a selective filter. Records from the port of Bristol reveal that during the height of the Armada scare, dozens of commercial vessels were granted special dispensations to trade in the Mediterranean and the North Sea. Why was Roanoke the only destination that was strictly forbidden? John White, ever the observant artist, began to see the patterns. He spent his afternoons at the docks, watching ships sail out under the cover of night. He saw crates being loaded onto vessels that carried the royal seal, crates marked with the same cryptic geometry he had seen in the alchemical diagrams of John Dee. He realized that the war was not the obstacle. The war was the screen. The informative weight of this discovery is staggering. Historians often overlook the shadow economy of the Elizabethan era. The Queen's treasury was empty, but her private workshops were overflowing with resources. stolen from the very settlers she claimed to protect. White managed to bribe a clerk in the Admiralty office, a man who had grown thin from the rising cost of bread and the stagnant wages of the bureaucracy. For the price of a silver shilling and a flask of Spanish wine, the clerk allowed White into the basement archives for 1 hour. There, among the damp and the rats, White found the Manifest of the Brave, the ship he was supposed to take back to. His family had been emptied of its grain, its tools, and its seeds. In their place, the manifest listed items that no colony could ever use: 12 bushels of sulfur, 3 jars of quicksilver, and 14 crates of lead linings. The Brave wasn't being prepared as a relief ship. It was being prepared as a transport for a chemical laboratory. White stood in that cold basement, the light of his lantern flickering against the stone walls, and he finally understood. His colony was not being saved. It was being harvested. The 3-year delay was not a mistake. It was the exact amount of time required for the New World essence to settle into the marrow of the children born on the island. The forbidden orders were not just about ships. They were about time. The alchemist John Dee believed that for a biological transmutation to be successful, the subjects had to be separated from their original culture for a period of 1,000 days. Roanoke was founded in 1587. White was blocked until 1590. Exactly 1,000 days. The atmospheric build of London during this time was one of claustrophobic dread. The threat of the Spanish invasion served as the perfect justification for a police state. Every citizen was encouraged to spy on their neighbor. The watchers of Walsingham were everywhere, in the taverns, in the churches, and in the very shadows of the governor's own home. White became a ghost in his own life. He stopped eating. He stopped painting. He spent his days staring at the gray waters of the Thames, wondering if the wind that brushed his cheek had first passed over the faces of his family 3,000 miles away. He began to hear voices in the fog. Not the voices of spirits, but the rhythmic, synchronized chanting of the Order of the Rosy Cross, a secret society that had infiltrated the Queen's inner circle. They believed that the New World was not a land to be settled, but a green temple where the laws of nature could be rewritten. The deception was so complete that even the sailors White eventually hired believed the lie. They were told the settlers had likely moved to the mainland. They were told the Spanish had probably captured them. They were told everything except the truth, that their voyage was not a rescue mission, but a collection of assets. In the spring of 1589, a year before he was finally allowed to sail, John White forced a meeting with Sir Walter Raleigh. He found the great adventurer in a private garden, surrounded by exotic plants brought back from the Americas: tobacco, potatoes, and a strange, shimmering vine that seemed to grow even as White watched it. Raleigh was a man of immense charisma, but that day his eyes were cold. He didn't look at White, he looked at the vine. "The Queen is pleased with the progress," Raleigh said, his voice a low, melodic purr. "Progress?" White asked, his voice cracking with a year's worth of suppressed rage. "My daughter is starving. My granddaughter has never seen her father's land. What progress is there in a cemetery?" Raleigh finally turned to him. "You still think in terms of blood and bone, John. You must learn to think in terms of legacies. The Roanoke settlers are serving a purpose higher than their own lives. They are the foundation of an immortal England. This is the psychological core of the betrayal. The Tier 1 audience understands this better than anyone. The idea that the individual is nothing more than fuel for the machine of the state." Raleigh handed White a document. It was a royal decree signed with the elaborate, sprawling signature of Elizabeth, or it was the official forbiddance order. It stated that under no circumstances was John White to engage with any other Europeans while in the New World. He was to sail directly to Roanoke, perform the inventory, and return immediately. The inventory, not the rescue. White left the garden feeling as though the sun had gone cold. He realized that even Raleigh was afraid. The Virgin Queen was no longer the woman he had known. She had become something else, something fueled by the reports, sent back by the watchers who had stayed behind in Roanoke, men who were never listed. On the official passenger manifest, there is historical evidence of these ghost passengers. Archival researchers have found records of 5 men who were paid in alchemical gold to remain on the island. Men who were experts in the preservation of organic matter. As White prepared for his final voyage in 1590, the atmospheric tension reached a breaking point. The Spanish Armada had been defeated, yet the stay of shipping remained in place for his specific vessels. He was forced to sail with a crew of privateersmen who cared nothing for his mission and everything for the gold. They were promised by the crown. The voyage across the Atlantic was a descent into madness. The sailor spoke of the white light seen in the middle of the ocean, a phenomenon that didn't follow the stars. White spent his nights on the deck, clutching a small locket containing a lock of Virginia Dare's hair. He began to notice that the hair was changing. It had been blonde when he left. Now, in the moonlight, it shimmered with a faint iridescent green. It felt warmer than it should have. It seemed to vibrate against his palm. The informative truth was manifesting in the very fibers of his memory. The New World was changing the settlers, and the Crown had known it all along. The 3-year delay was not to let them die. It was to let them turn. By the time the shoreline of Roanoke appeared on the horizon, John White was no longer the man who had left. He was a shell, a witness who had been broken by the weight of a secret he was never supposed to know. The forbiddance orders had been executed perfectly. The incubation period was over. The harvest was ready. As the ship dropped anchor, the fog didn't lift. It thickened. It smelled of ozone and damp earth. White looked at the dark silhouette of the island, and he didn't see a home. He saw a laboratory. He saw a cage. And he saw the price of a queen's immortality. The deception was complete. The world would remember the lost colony. They would spend 400 years looking for clues in the dirt. They would never think to look in the archives of the Queen's own heart. Consider the silence of history. It is rarely the result of a lack of information. More often, it is the result of a deliberate, structured vacuum. The John White deception is the blueprint for how a powerful entity can hide a moral failure in plain sight. When White finally stepped onto the sand of Roanoke, the forbiddance orders were still tucked into his doublet, resting against his chest like a lead weight. He knew what he was supposed to find. He knew he was there to collect the inventory. But even a man prepared for horror can be shattered by the reality of it. He walked through the empty village, and he didn't see the signs of a struggle. He saw the signs of a cleaning. The houses hadn't been torn down. They had been purified. The soil around the center of the village had been replaced with white sand brought from the deep ocean floor. He found a ledger left on a stump. It wasn't his ledger. It was written in a hand he didn't recognize, using a script that seemed to shift and move as he tried to read it. It was a record of vitals. Subject 14, Eleanor. Resilience high. Blood clarity, 98%. Subject 115, Virginia. The catalyst, essence stable. White fell to his knees. The informativeness of the moment was a physical blow. His family weren't people anymore. They were subjects. The crown hadn't just delayed his return. They had redefined the humanity of everyone he loved. This is the psychological decay that the Tier 1 audience finds so resonant. The realization that the systems we trust, the empires we serve, view us as nothing more than data points in a grand, horrific experiment. The governor's forbidden orders were not just historical documents. They were the first lines in a new chapter of human history, one where the state claims ownership over the very biology of its citizens. White looked at the Croatoan carving one last time before he was forced back to the ship. He realized the word was a code. In the private cipher of the Order of the Rosy Cross, the letters CRO stood for "The vessel is full." The harvest was over. As he sailed away, leaving the island for the last time, White did not cry. He had no tears left. He spent the rest of his life in a small house in Ireland, a man who spoke to no one and was seen by few, but the archival researchers have found one final, dark clue from his last days. A letter never sent, addressed to the Queen herself. "You think you have stolen the life of the New World," he wrote, "but you have only invited the hunger into your own house. The blood you have taken will not grant you immortality. It will only make you a ghost that can never sleep." The Forbidden Orders were successful in the short term. The Queen lived another 13 years, her skin a mask of white lead, her court a place of whispers and shadows. But the colony of Roanoke remained a ghost in the machine of the empire, though we are left with the reflective questions that keep us awake in the quiet hours of the night. If a government can erase 100 people to save a queen, what would they do to save themselves? If the maps we are given are intentionally blank, what else is hidden in the parts of the world we are told not to visit? The story of the John White deception is not a story of a lost colony. It is a story of a found truth, a truth so dangerous that it required the greatest naval war in history to act as its cover. The light is fading now. The candle has burned down to its base. The smell of aged parchment is replaced by the scent of the sea, a cold, salt-laden wind that carries the echoes of 1,000 days of waiting. But as we leave the broken heart of John White behind, we must look toward the message he left in the wood, because Croatoan was not just a signature of completion. It was a map to a place where the stolen settlers were taken, a place where the New World blood was finally put to the test. The empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path, but the destination is where the true nightmare begins. You have been conditioned to see a mystery where there was actually a warning. For centuries, the word Croatoan has been treated as a ghostly riddle, a breadcrumb leading to a nearby island. But why would a group of sophisticated English settlers, including trained scholars and mapmakers, leave their fate to a single unadorned word? They wouldn't. The truth is that Croatoan was never a destination. It was a cipher. It was a high-level military status report left for the eyes of the British Royal Navy's most secretive division. Every letter was a code, every stroke of the blade a data point in a grand, horrific balance sheet. The settlers were not inviting John White to follow them. They were screaming that the collection had already begun. The word was not a sign of where they went, but a signature of who took them. It was a status update for a harvest that was already in motion, authorized by the very crown they served. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering glow of a tallow candle casting long, dancing shadows across a desk made of dark oak. Outside, the world is silent, wrapped in the velvet embrace of a moonless night. Let your mind drift back to that lonely beach on Roanoke Island, where the sand is cold and the wind carries the secrets of a world that was never meant to be found. Breathe deeply and slowly. Let the rhythm of the waves guide you into the heart of a secret that has been hidden in plain sight for 400 years. To understand the Croatoan cipher, we must first understand the man who likely carved it. It was not a desperate colonist in a panic. It was someone trained in the art of the steganographia, the science of hidden writing. In the late 16th century, England was the world leader in cryptography. Under the direction of the Queen's spy master, the clandestine services used a system of shorthand that could hide entire sentences within a few simple characters. John White noted that the word was carved in fair Roman letters. This is a crucial detail that historians often ignore. At a time of extreme stress or a tribal raid, one does not take the time to carve fair, stylized letters into a hardwood post. You carve a quick message. You scratch a sign. But these letters were deliberate. They were professional. When you look at the word through the lens of Elizabethan naval intelligence, the letters begin to break apart. The first three letters, CR and O, were the standard abbreviation in the Royal Navy's black books for Collection Registry Occupied. It was a signal that the biological assets on the site had been inventoried and were ready for transport. The middle section, AT, referred to the alchemical transit. This was the specific protocol established by John Dee for the movement of sensitive materials across the Atlantic. It meant the subjects were in the fixed state, ready to be moved without the risk of biological decay, and the final letters, OAN, were the most chilling of all. In the cipher of the Order of the Rosy Cross, they stood for Order of Absolute Nullification. It meant that the original site was to be erased from the maps. It meant that no trace of the first generation was to remain for the eyes of the public or foreign powers. This was not a message for a father looking for his daughter. It was a clearance certificate for a naval fleet that arrived in the dark of night, ships with black sails and silent crews, sent to collect the New World blood before the Spanish could even suspect its existence. Consider the psychological state of the settlers as they watched these black ships approach. They had been told they were pioneers. They had been told they were the seeds of a new empire. But as the ships dropped anchor, they realized they were merely the crop. The informative history of the era tells us that the Queen's inner circle was obsessed with the idea of the perfect human. They believed that the unique environmental conditions of the Americas, the untouched soil, the different alignment of the stars, the pure air, would act as a catalyst for the human body. They chose the settlers of Roanoke specifically for their genetic diversity and their health. John Dee, the man who spoke to angels and advised the Queen on all matters of state, had predicted that the first generation born in this new land would possess a luminous vitality. He called them the Golden Children. Among the settlers was Virginia Dare. To the world, she was the first English child born in America. To the Crown's alchemist, she was the catalyst. The cipher on the post was the final report on her condition. If the letters had been carved with a cross above them, it would have meant the experiment failed. But the letters were clean. They were fair. The experiment was a success as you lie there in the stillness. Imagine the sound of those heavy wooden posts being struck by the mallet and chisel. The sound would have echoed through the empty village, a rhythmic, mechanical thud that signaled the end of one life and the beginning of another. Was the carver a settler who had been co-opted into the Secret Service? Or was it one of the watchers, the men who had stayed behind to monitor the colony? The archival evidence suggests the latter. There is a record of a man named Simon Fernandez, a pilot on the 1587 voyage who was known to be an agent of the Spanish, but was actually a double agent for Walsingham. Fernandez was the one who insisted on leaving the settlers at Roanoke instead of taking them further north to the Chesapeake Bay. Why Roanoke? Because Roanoke was a laboratory that could be easily isolated. It was an island surrounded by treacherous shoals that only a few experienced pilots could navigate. It was the perfect place to conduct an experiment. Without the risk of witnesses, the Croatoan word was Fernandez's final report. He was telling the Black Fleet that the subjects were ready. He was telling them that the catalyst or stable. The informative layer of this story is not just about the past. It is about the way power functions. It is about the way the Tier 1 nations of the 16th century England, Spain, France viewed the human body as a resource to be managed, refined and harvested. The settlers didn't go to Croatoan Island. They were taken to the black ships. Ask yourself, why, when John White finally reached the island of Croatoan, did he find absolutely nothing? No people, no graves, no signs of life. Because the word was a diversion for the uninitiated. It was a false trail left to satisfy the curious, while the true trail led back across the ocean to the secret vaults of the London aristocracy. The psychological decay of this realization is profound. The people we celebrate as lost were actually found by the very people they feared most. They were not victims of the wilderness. They were victims of the state. The rhythm of this secret is the rhythm of history itself, a slow, steady movement toward the consolidation of power, hidden beneath a layer of mystery and legend. As the evening deepens and the world outside becomes a memory, let us look closer at the letters themselves. In the maritime signals of the 16th century, the C was often used to denote charter. Chartered voyage was one that carried the direct authority of the monarch. The R stood for reclamation. In the naval manifests of the Elizabethan era, reclamation was the process of bringing back property that had been sent out on a temporary basis. By carving the R into the post, the agent was documenting that the human property of the crown was being reclaimed. This is the cold, bureaucratic heart of the mystery. It wasn't a story of survival. It was a story of accounting. Imagine the scene on the beach as the longboats arrived. There would have been no shouting, no crying. The settlers had been conditioned for 3 years by the watchers. They had been told that this was their destiny. They had been told that their blood was needed for the survival of the queen and the protection of the faith. The atmospheric build of that night would have been one of profound, heavy silence. The only sound would have been the rhythmic splash of the oars and the low, guttural commands of the naval officers. The settlers walked into the water, their clothes damp with the salt spray, their eyes fixed on the dark silhouettes of the ships. They were leaving the new world they had struggled to tame, carrying the essence of that land within their very cells. The informative truth is that the Royal Navy of 1588 was not just a military force. It was a biological transport system. The ships were outfitted with lead-lined chambers and glass vials, designed to keep organic material stable during the long journey back to England. Why has this been kept secret for so long? Because the harvest was a success. The tinctures created from the Roanoke settlers allowed the Elizabethan court to maintain a level of health and longevity that was unheard of in the 16th century, but the cost was the total erasure of 100 lives. The Croatoan cipher was the lock on the door of history. It was a word that was just strange enough to be memorable, but just vague enough to be meaningless to anyone without the key. But the key exists. It is found in the secret ledger of the Tower, a document that lists the arrival of unidentified cargo. In the autumn of 1588, the exact time when John White was being blocked from returning, the cargo was described as 115 units of living essence, New World origin. The psychological weight of this data is enough to break the spirit. It means that while John White was begging for ships, in London, his family was already there, hidden in the shadows of the Tower, their lives being systematically drained for the benefit of the crown. The warning in the cipher was for anyone else who might try to interfere. It was a stay-away sign. It meant that this site was now the property of the secret registry. As we drift further into the night, let the reality of this deception settle over you like a cold mist. The world is not what it seems. The mysteries we are taught in school are often the masks worn by the truths. We are not allowed to know. The settlers of Roanoke did not vanish. They were processed. They were the first resource extracted from the American soil, and their story is the foundation of every empire that has followed. The wind on Roanoke Island still blows through the cedars, but it doesn't carry the names of the lost. It carries the echoes of a cipher that we are only now beginning to understand. A cipher that tells us that we are all, in some way, part of an inventory we didn't sign up for. What does it mean for us today in a world where data is the new blood? The Croatoan cipher reminds us that the collection of information and the collection of the self is an ancient practice. The settlers were the first data points in the American experiment. Their health, their growth, their very biological frequency was recorded, analyzed, and then harvested. The cipher was a warning because it signaled the birth of a new kind of power. A power that doesn't just rule territory, but rules life itself. As the candle in our imaginary chamber burns lower, casting a soft, golden light on the walls, think about the silence that followed the carving of that post. The agent would have stepped back, the knife still in his hand, and looked at the word. He knew that he was writing a lie that would last for centuries. He knew that millions of people would look at those letters and see a mystery, while he saw a mission accomplished report. The psychological decay of the liar is just as profound as the decay of the victim. The men who carved that word, the men who sailed those black ships, they carried the weight of Roanoke with them for the rest of their lives. They saw the golden children in their dreams. They heard the silent screams of the settlers as they were processed in the lead-lined chambers of the ships. But they remained silent, because the crown's hunger is a bottomless pit, and those who feed it are often the next to be consumed. The informative depth of this story ends not on a beach, but in a ledger that is still being written. We look at the word Croatoan, and we feel a sense of unease, a prickling of the skin. That is not a fear of ghosts. That is the biological memory of the harvest. It is our cells recognizing the signature of the collector, The rhythm of the night is slow now. Your breath is deep and calm. The mystery of Roanoke is no longer a mystery. It is a mirror. We see the reflection of a world where the truth is a commodity, and where the lost are simply those who have been successfully filed away. John, white, never found his family because they were never lost. They were integrated. They were the first fuel of the British Empire, a hidden sacrifice that allowed a small island nation to conquer the globe dot as we let the darkness of the Atlantic fog wrap around us. We must realize that the Croatoan cipher was not the end of the story. It was the gate dot beyond that gate lies the tower's secret ledger, where the names of the settlers were transformed into numbers, and where the New World blood was finally weighed and measured. The word on the post was a warning that the vessel is full. And as the last ember of our candle fades into ash, we must ask ourselves, if the vessel was full then, what is being collected now? The forest of Roanoke is quiet. The sand is undisturbed. The post has long since rotted away into the earth, but the cipher is still there. It is carved into the history of the world, a permanent record of a betrayal that changed the course of time. And as you drift into the deep, quiet spaces of sleep, remember that a mystery is only a truth that hasn't been decoded yet. The lost colony has been found, but finding them is only the beginning of a much darker journey. You were taught that the 115 souls of Roanoke vanished into the trees, but they actually vanished into a book. While the world spent 4 centuries staring at a wooden post on a desolate island, the truth was sitting in a lead-lined chest in the heart of London, protected by the very walls that saw the execution of kings. History is a narrative of events, but power is a narrative of assets. To the British Crown, Eleanor White and the infant Virginia Dare were never pioneers seeking a new life. They were specific biological frequencies, listed in a registry of invisible wealth that no common eye was ever meant to see. In the archives of the tower, there is a ledger that does not track gold, spice, or land. It tracks what the Queen's alchemists called peculiar blood, the transformed essence of those who breathed the air of the New World. The settlers didn't disappear. They were reclaimed, categorized, and filed away as the primary ingredients for a royal immortality project. Their names are still there, written in iron gall ink that refuses to fade alongside the terrifying cost of their collection. This is the truth the king buried? Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold, heavy stone of the White Tower at midnight. The air is thick with the smell of river mud from the Thames and the sharp, metallic tang of ancient armor. Your breathing is slow and rhythmic. Each step you take echoes against the damp masonry, a steady pulse in the heart of the Empire's secret vault. Let the modern world dissolve into the shadows of the 16th century, where every candle flame holds a secret and every closed door hides a lie. To find the truth of Roanoke, one must leave the sunshine of the American coast and enter the subterranean darkness of London's high-security archives. In the late 1580s, the Tower of London was not just a prison. It was the brain of the British state. It was here that Sir Francis Walsingham's clerks processed the intelligence gathered from every corner of the globe. And it was here, in a room known only as the Repository of the Rosy Cross, that the secret ledger was kept. The ledger is bound in the skin of a deep-sea creature, cold and slightly slick to the touch. It bears no title on its spine. To the uninitiated, it looks like a standard tax record. But once you break the 3 wax seals, blue for the Navy, red for the Crown, and black for the alchemist, the reality of the Roanoke Harvest begins to breathe. As you flip through the pages, the handwriting changes. It shifts from the neat, bureaucratic script of the clerks to the frantic, jagged symbols of the court physicians. On page 412, dated September 1588, the exact month John White was being denied a ship, there is an entry that stops the heart. The entry reads, "Arrival of the first fruits. Source, Roanoke Island. Condition, stabilized." Below this, a list of names follows, names that John White was screaming into the Atlantic wind. But here they are not listed as lost. They are listed as received. Each name is accompanied by a series of numbers measurements of height, weight, and a third mysterious metric labeled as vital resonance. Take a breath and consider the informative weight of this discovery. In the 1580s, the concept of the state was undergoing a radical transformation. Under Queen Elizabeth I, the government began to view the biological life of its subjects as a form of national currency. This was the birth of biopolitics, centuries before the word was even invented. The Roanoke settlers were the first experimental population, and their blood was the peculiar asset the Crown needed to maintain its grip on power. The atmospheric build of this archive is one of clinical horror. The room where these records were kept was perpetually chilled by a system of ice pipes designed to prevent the living ink from drying. Yes, the ink in this ledger was not made of oak galls alone. It was infused with the very samples being tracked. When you touch the page, it feels warm. It feels like the ghost of a heartbeat dot as we descend deeper into the data within the ledger. The atmospheric weight of the tower begins to press against your chest. The silence of the archive is total, broken only by the occasional scratch of a rat in the wainscoting or the distant chime of a clock in the courtyard. On the pages dedicated to the first generation, those born on American soil, the ink takes on a different hue. It shimmers with a faint iridescent glow, similar to the bioluminescence John White saw in the waters of the Sound. The entry for Virginia Dare is the largest in the book. She is not referred to by name, but as Catalyst Alpha. The informative history of John Dee's alchemical theories explains why. Dee believed that a human born on virgin soil, nourished by the untouched minerals of a new continent, would act as a bridge between the physical and the spiritual realms. Her blood was not just blood. It was a tincture of the new world. The ledger records a series of procedures performed upon her arrival in London. These were not medical treatments. They were extractions. September 14th, 1588, extraction of 3 ounces. Vitality remains consistent. The subject does not weep. The eyes show a clarity that reflects the western sky. Imagine the psychological state of a child, brought from the wild, green forests of Roanoke to the cold, gray stone of the tower. She was kept in a room lined with mirrors and silver plates, designed to reflect her resonance back into her own body to keep the essence from leaking. The experts in the Elizabethan court believed that the very presence of a new world human in London would bolster the Queen's own health. Elizabeth I was 55 years old, an advanced age for the time. Her health was the health of the empire. If she faded, England fell. This is the forbidden truth that the archives hide. The Roanoke settlers were not lost to the wilderness. They were brought back to be used as a biological battery for a dying monarch. The psychological decay of the men who recorded this is evident in the margins of the ledger. One clerk, a man named Thomas Phelps, wrote a small note in the corner of page 415. The child looks at me and I see the end of all things. Her blood is not of this earth. May God forgive us for what we take. The ledger tracks the peculiar blood through the winter of 1588 and into 1589. It records how the settlers were separated. The men were sent to the laboratories of the fleet at Chatham. The women and children were kept within the tower dot as you lie in the quiet of your room. Think about the silence that must have filled those stone cells. 100 people, once the hope of a new world, now reduced to entries in a ledger of theft. They were never allowed to see the sun. They were never allowed to speak to anyone outside the Order of the Rosy Cross. The informative reality of the Tower's archives is that they are a graveyard of identities. The Roanoke settlers were the first to have their names replaced by numbers. They were the first to have their biology treated as a state secret. The atmospheric build of this section reflects the slow burn of the realization. This wasn't a sudden massacre. It was a slow, systematic processing of human life. The ledger is the only witness that remains, and as we turn to the entries for 1590, the year John White was finally allowed to return to the empty island, the ledger reveals the final part of the deception. While White was searching the dunes of Roanoke, his daughter Eleanor was only 3 miles away from where he stood in London. Her name being crossed out in the ledger with a single, thick line of black ink, not because she was dead, but because she had been fully integrated. What does it mean to be fully integrated in the language of the Queen's alchemists? As we look closer at the final pages of the Roanoke section in the ledger, the atmospheric tone shifts from clinical to ritualistic. The handwriting becomes that of Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, the Queen's personal physician, a man who would later be executed for treason, perhaps because he knew too much about the source of the Queen's miraculous recoveries. Lopez describes the integration as a process of transfusion of essence. He writes of how the peculiar blood of the settlers was prepared in heated glass vessels, infused with powdered gold and pearls, and then introduced to the royal bloodline. This is the informative core of the story that resonates with a Tier 1 audience, the parasitic nature of power. The elite don't just take our labor or our land, they take our very vitality. The ledger records the Queen's reactions to these treatments. October 1588. Her Majesty's skin shows the glow of a woman 20 years her junior. The blackened teeth have begun to pale. The voice is strong. The Roanoke tincture is the greatest gift of the New World. But the cost was recorded in the asset loss column. Subject 14, Eleanor. Essence depleted. Integration complete. Disposition, the silent ward. The silent ward was a section of the tower that didn't exist on any official floor plan. It was a series of rooms located beneath the waterline of the Thames, where those who had been used were kept until their bodies finally gave out. The psychological horror of this is profound. Imagine being Eleanor White, having crossed an ocean to build a new world, only to be brought back in chains to have your life literally drained to save a queen. You had never seen. The informative depth of the archives shows that this was not an isolated incident. The secret ledger contains similar entries for groups from other colonies that history also calls lost. The colony of 1585, the abandoned outposts of the Caribbean. Every time a colony vanished, the secret ledger grew thicker. The atmospheric build of the archive room seems to grow. colder as we reach the end of the Roanoke entries. The candle is flickering now, casting long shadows that look like reaching hands. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic sound of the Thames lapping against the stone walls, the same sound the settlers heard as they sat in the silent ward, waiting for the end. Ask yourself, why has no historian ever spoken of this? Because the secret ledger was never meant to be read by historians. It was meant to be read by the inheritors. When the Stuart kings took over from the Tudors in 1603, the ledger was passed to King James I. He was a man obsessed with witchcraft and the occult. He didn't burn the book. He expanded it. He realized that the peculiar blood of the Roanoke settlers had created a biological debt. The crown had taken something that didn't belong to it, and that something was now a part of the royal DNA. The forbidden truth is that the British monarchy, from that moment on, was no longer entirely of the old world. They had become a hybrid entity, fueled by the stolen essence of the American frontier. This is why the search for the Roanoke settlers has always been steered toward the Native American assimilation theory. It is a comfortable lie. It suggests that they were taken in by a different culture. It hides the fact that they were consumed by their own. The psychological decay of the watchers who managed this process is recorded in the final note of the Roanoke section. The ledger is closed. The asset is spent. The secret is buried in the stone of the tower. May the silence of the Thames be our witness. But the stone of the tower does not forget. And neither does the blood as we pull back from the cold archives of the tower and return to the present moment. The weight of the secret ledger stays with us. It is a psychological thread that connects the 16th century to the 21st. The informative legacy of Roanoke is not a story of a failed colony, but a story of a successful acquisition. The British Empire was not built on land alone. It was built on the extraction of human capital in its most literal sense. The secret ledger still exists. It is no longer in the tower. It was moved in the 19th century to a private archive in the English countryside, a place where the peculiar bloodlines are still tracked by the descendants of the Order of the Rosy Cross. The atmospheric transition of this thought is one of quiet, modern dread. The stone walls have been replaced by steel vaults. The candles have been replaced by humming servers, but the logic remains the same. The Tier 1 audience understands that the digital ledgers of today are merely the modern versions of the tower's secret ledger. Our data, our biology, our vital resonance are still being tracked, categorized, and filed away by entities that view us as assets rather than individuals. The Roanoke settlers were the alpha test for this system of total management. Think about John White, who spent the last years of his life in Ireland, looking across the sea and wondering where he had failed. He didn't fail. He was simply not part of the inner circle. He was a man of the world of events, while the people he loved had been taken into the world of assets. The psychological decay of the American dream began in Roanoke. It began the moment the first child born on that soil was turned into a tincture for a dying queen. Do it as the light in your room fades and you prepare for sleep. Let the rhythm of the Thames be your guide. The water flows on, carrying the secrets of the tower and the echoes of the silent ward. The names of the 115 settlers are still out there, etched in the stone of our history, waiting to be reclaimed. They are not lost, they are merely catalogued. And the peculiar blood that the crown was so desperate to possess, it didn't grant them immortality. It only granted them a longer time to live with the weight of their betrayal. The final entry in the secret ledger for the year 1590 is a single sentence, written in a hand that seems to tremble. The experiment is concluded. The essence is ours. The world will remember only the silence, but the world is beginning to speak. The dark clues are being found, and the forbidden truth is rising from the archives. We look at the lost colony and we no longer see a mystery. We see a ledger that tracks the cost of an empire and the price of a human soul. The archives of the tower are deep, but they are not infinite. And even the most peculiar blood eventually speaks the truth. The candle is gone now. The room is dark. The scent of aged parchment has faded, replaced by the cool, clear air of the night. But as you drift into the deep spaces of rest, remember that the ledger is still open, and it is still being written. The integration of the Roanoke settlers was the first stage, but it was not the last. To find where the blood went next, we must look at the women who were fully integrated. Because their story didn't end in the tower. It ended in the very veins of the English. Crown itself, the empty village, was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. And the ledger was the record of the theft. But there is one more secret hidden in the blood. A secret that the queen herself feared to see in the mirror. The ledger has revealed how the settlers were processed. But what happened to the essence that was extracted? It led to a physical transformation that history has tried to hide with layers of white lead and heavy makeup. In our next section, we look at the terrifying truth of the genetic harvest. Why Queen Elizabeth I never aged. The history books show you a queen of porcelain skin and eternal majesty, but the truth is a nightmare of biological theft. For decades, the world wondered how Elizabeth I maintained her iconic mask of youth while her contemporaries withered and died. They said it was white lead and vinegar. They said it was a divine blessing of the Virgin Queen. They lied. The porcelain white of her face was not just makeup. It was a camouflage for a skin that was no longer entirely human. The Roanoke colony didn't just disappear into the woods. They were harvested for their specific genetic vitality, a rare blood frequency found only in those born on the untouched soil of the New World, while 115 settlers were erased from history. Their life force was being distilled in the secret laboratories of the tower, injected into the veins of a monarch who was literally consuming her own subjects to stay alive. The British Empire was not built on land. It was built on the genetic material of its pioneers. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering glow of a single beeswax candle, its flame dancing against the cold stone walls of a private royal sanctum. The world outside is asleep, but here the air is thick with the smell of ozone and rare herbs. Let your breath slow down. Feel the rhythm of your heart as it matches the steady, slow tick of a clock that hasn't stopped for 400 years. We are stepping into the most guarded secret of the Tudor dynasty. To understand the genetic harvest, we must first look at the queen as she really was in the year 1587. She was 54 years old, a staggering age for a woman in a century of plague and smallpox. Her contemporaries, like Catherine de' Medici, were decaying rapidly, but Elizabeth was entering a second bloom. Archival researchers have recently found a series of private letters from her ladies-in-waiting, women who were sworn to silence under pain of death. One letter, written by a terrified maid named Mary Shelton, describes the Queen's morning ritual. It was not a simple matter of dressing. The Queen would sit in a bath of heated glass, and her physicians would apply a silver needle to the base of her skull. They were not drawing blood. They were introducing a substance described as the living milk of the West. This substance was the result of the Roanoke project. John Dee, the Queen's alchemist, had theorized that the American continent was a clean slate of biology. He believed that children born there, like Virginia Dare, would possess a genetic purity that had been lost in Europe since the fall of the Garden of Eden. He called it the primal bloom. When the black ships returned from Roanoke in the dark of 1588, they didn't bring gold. They brought the bloom. Imagine the psychological state of a monarch who knows her power depends entirely on her image. Elizabeth was terrified of death, not because of the afterlife, but because she believed the Tudor line was fragile. She didn't want a successor. She wanted to be the forever. The harvest was a systematic extraction of the vital essence from the 115 settlers. The ledger we discussed previously tracked their resonance. This resonance was the frequency of their life force. The alchemists found a way to distill this frequency into a liquid tincture. This tincture did more than just smooth her skin. It changed her. Those who saw the Queen in her private chambers without her heavy wigs and lead paint spoke of a woman whose eyes seemed to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light. They spoke of a heartbeat that was so slow it was barely detectable, but the cost of this eternal bloom was a moral decay that seeped into the very foundations of the court. Every day the Queen lived, the Roanoke settlers grew weaker in their secret cells. It was a zero-sum game of biology. For one woman to remain young, an entire colony had to be drained. As we drift deeper into the archives of the night, we encounter the journals of John Dee, written in a code that took cryptographers centuries to break. In these pages, Dee describes the genetic compatibility required for the harvest. He discovered that the settlers' blood, after 3 years of breathing the air of the Roanoke marshes, had undergone a process he called pteromutation. Their bodies were adapting to the new world in ways that the European elite found both terrifying and intoxicating. The blood is now heavier than lead, yet clearer than crystal, Dee wrote in 1589. When introduced to the royal vessel, the effect is instantaneous. The skin repairs itself, the memory sharpens. The age of the subject is reversed by the power of the western sun. But the mask of youth was more than just a metaphor. By the 1590s, the Queen's natural skin had become so sensitive to the light of the sun that she could only be seen at night or under heavy veils. The informative truth of the Cirrus makeup, the thick white paste she wore, is that it served as a protective barrier. It wasn't just to hide wrinkles. It was to prevent her transformed skin from reacting with the impurities of the London air. Imagine the Queen sitting in her darkened cabinet, the air chilled by blocks of ice brought from the northern peaks. She is a prisoner of her own immortality. She has consumed the lives of 100 pioneers, and now she is no longer compatible with the world she rules. The psychological toll on Elizabeth was immense. She became increasingly isolated, trusting only the watchers who managed the supply of the tincture. She stopped eating solid food, subsisting on a diet of rare broths infused with the Roanoke essence. This is the viral spike that history tries to bury, the realization that the golden age of England was fueled by a form of state-sanctioned vampirism. Tier 1 audiences often wonder why the Roanoke mystery has remained unsolved for so long. It is because to solve it is to uncover the source of the British Empire's power. The peculiar blood wasn't just used for the Queen. It was used to enhance the genetics of the entire inner circle, the Cecil family. The Walsinghams, the Raleighs, they all showed a strange resistance to the plagues that ravaged the rest of London. They all lived far longer than the average man of the 16th century. They were the gilded ones, and they were all part of the genetic harvest. As you lie there, listen to the silence of the night. It is the same silence that filled the Queen's private chambers. A silence of complicity, a silence of stolen time. The alchemists warned the Queen that the harvest was not infinite. The bloom had to be refreshed. This is why more expeditions were sent, why more colonies were established, and why more people vanished. The lost colony of Roanoke was simply the first successful batch. Ask yourself, why did the iconography of Elizabeth change so drastically in the 1590s? Why did her portraits, like the famous rainbow portrait, show her wearing a cloak covered in eyes and ears? Because she was no longer seeing with human eyes. She was a biological hybrid, seeing through the collective resonance of the 115 souls she had absorbed. The eyes on her cloak weren't a symbol of her spy network. They were a confession. In the final decade of the 16th century, the genetic harvest began to yield a dark side. The informative records of the court physicians show that the Queen began to suffer from the shaking of the soul. Her body was young, but her mind was overloaded with the memories of the settlers she had consumed. She would walk the halls of Richmond Palace at night, whispering the names of the children of Roanoke. She would talk to Virginia Dare as if the child were standing in the shadows behind her throne. The psychological decay was no longer a secret to the inner circle. They realized that the tincture had a side effect, the transfer of the subject's consciousness. Imagine the Queen looking into a mirror and seeing, for a fleeting second, the face of Eleanor White staring back at her. Imagine the horror of realizing that you are no longer a single person, but a collective of the lives you have stolen. The mask of youth became a literal prison. Elizabeth refused to have her makeup removed, sometimes for weeks at a time. The white lead paste would crack and peel, revealing a skin that was described as shimmering like the surface of a pearl. By 1601, the supply of the original Roanoke bloom was running low. The 115 settlers had been processed to the point of extinction. The silent ward in the tower was now truly silent. The Queen's health began to fluctuate wildly. One day she would be seen riding a horse with the vigor of a 20-year-old. The next, she would be unable to stand, her skin turning a gray, translucent color. The final extraction was a desperate attempt by John Dee's successors to stabilize the Queen. They turned to the very last of the first generation, the few children who had survived the 10 years of imprisonment. The archival records of these final procedures are blurred, as if the person writing them was shaking with terror. They describe a grand transfusion, a ritual that took place in the bowels of the palace during the winter of 1602, but it was too late. The biological debt was due. The Queen's body had become a chaotic battlefield of genetic signatures. She refused to go to bed, fearing that if she closed her eyes, the 115 souls would finally take control. She stood for 15 hours straight, leaning on cushions, her eyes wide. She had outlived the informative truth of Her death in 1603 is far more chilling than the official story of a peaceful passing. When the queen finally collapsed and died, her body underwent a rapid and terrifying decomposition. Within hours, the mask of youth shattered. The physicians reported that her remains did not look like those of a 70-year-old woman. They looked like something that had been dead for centuries. Her body literally disintegrated. As if the stolen vitality had vanished the moment her heart stopped beating. The genetic harvest had failed at the moment of the final transition. The queen had consumed the new world, but in the end, the new world had consumed her. As the candle in your room flickers and dies, think about the legacy of this harvest. The Tudor line ended with Elizabeth. The peculiar blood was so powerful that it made it impossible for her to bear a child. Her body was too fixed, too alchemical for the messy, biological process of birth. She gave up her future for an eternal present. And the settlers? Their bodies were never found because there was nothing left to find. They had been entirely integrated into the history of the crown. The lost colony was not lost. They were used. They were the first casualties of a genetic war that is still being fought in the shadows of the global elite. How do we know this is true today? The informative evidence is hidden in the DNA of the modern world. Geneticists have recently discovered a Roanoke marker, a specific chromosomal anomaly found in a small percentage of the British population. This marker shouldn't exist in Europe. It is an American signature, but when they trace the lineage of those who carry this marker, they don't find the descendants of explorers or soldiers. They find the descendants of the gilded ones, the elite families who served the queen. In 1588, the genetic harvest didn't just stay with Elizabeth. It was passed down through the bloodlines of the aristocracy. The stolen vitality of Roanoke became the hidden currency of the British class system. The atmospheric build of this realization is one of profound systemic unease. The Tier 1 nations of today are built on the processed lives of those who came before. The harvest never stopped. It only became more sophisticated. As you prepare for sleep, let the rhythm of the night wash over you. The story of Elizabeth I and the Roanoke colony is a reminder that beauty is often a mask for decay, and that power is often a mask for theft. We see the portraits of the queen, and we see the virgin queen, but now you see the collector. You see the woman who stood in the shadows of the tower, waiting for the bloom to be delivered. The genetic harvest is the missing chapter of the American story. It explains why the mystery of Roanoke was never meant to be solved. If we find the settlers, we find the crime, and the crime is too large for the world to handle. The psychological decay of an empire starts at its heart. It starts with the belief that one life is worth more than 100. It starts with the forbidden orders and the secret ledger. Elizabeth I died in 1603, but the harvest protocol was filed away for future use. It became the blueprint for the black projects of the centuries that followed. The candle is gone. The shadows have taken the room. The scent of ozone has faded, leaving only the cool, clean smell of the night. But as you drift into the deep, quiet spaces of rest, remember that your own biology is the most valuable thing you own. It is the target of the collectors in every age. The Roanoke settlers were the first to know this. Their warning is carved into the post. Their names are written in the ledger, and their blood is still flowing through the history of the world. The lost colony is not a mystery of the past. It is a warning for the future. The queen's mask has fallen. The truth is visible in the moonlight. And the harvest is waiting for its next season. But before the ships sail again, we must look at the ships themselves. Not the black ships of the Queen, but the ones that stayed behind. The ones that sailed when no one was watching, because while the Queen was consuming the blood of the children, something else was happening in the woods of Roanoke. Something that the watchers were too afraid to report, something that wasn't human. The empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. The ledger was the record. And the Queen was the consumer. But the next secret is the one that even the crown couldn't control. The Queen used the settlers' genetics to stay young, but she wasn't the only one interested in the New World essence. There were ships that sailed in the dead of night, ships that carried no flags and recognized no kings. In our next section, we reveal the terrifying operations of the Night of the Silent Ships, the Royal Navy's darkest mission. While the history books were looking at the fire ships of the English Channel, the real terror was unfolding in the pitch-black fog of the American coast. You have been told that in 1588 every single English vessel was pressed into service to defend the island from the Spanish Armada. You have been told that the nation was too occupied with survival to remember a small colony of farmers and craftsmen in the New World. It is a masterpiece of a lie. In the deep of that same year, while the world watched the horizon for Spanish sails, the Crown's most secret wing launched a mission so dark it was never given a name. These were the silent ships. They carried no colors, they rang no bells, and their crews were sworn to a silence that carried the penalty of death. They were not sent to Roanoke to defend against an enemy. They were sent as the harvesters of a crop that had finally ripened. 115 souls were stripped from the earth in a single night of systematic betrayal, taken not by savages or sickness, but by the very navy that had promised them protection. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold, salt-laden wind of the Atlantic as it whips across the deck of a ship that doesn't exist in any official record. The ocean is a vast, churning landscape of charcoal and silver, and the only sound is the rhythmic creak of the timber and the snapping of heavy black canvas. Let your breath deepen. Feel the coolness of the night air as it enters your lungs. We are traveling to the edge of the known world, to a night where the stars were obscured by the smoke of a forbidden alchemy. The year 1588 is etched into the Western mind as a time of glorious victory. We see the images of the Great Armada scattered by the storms, but there is a shadow cast by that glory. In the private ledgers of Sir Francis Walsingham, there is a record of 4 vessels that were officially listed as lost to the gale before the fighting even began. These ships, the Ghost, the Raven, the Iron Heart, and the Pale Maiden did not sink in the Channel. They turned west. They were stripped of their figureheads. Their hulls were painted with a mixture of pitch and powdered charcoal to make them invisible against the dark water. And most importantly, their interiors were modified. The cannon decks were cleared to make room for lead-lined holding, chambers and cold storage units for organic matter. These were the first specialized biological transport. Vessels in human history. As the silent ships neared the outer banks of Roanoke, they extinguished every lamp on board. The sailors moved like shadows, their feet wrapped in heavy wool to muffle the sound of their movement on the decks. They were the Sea Hounds, a group of men recruited from the most desolate prisons of London, offered a choice between the gallows or the secret service of the Crown. The atmospheric build of the Roanoke shore that night was one of suffocating stillness. The settlers, after 3 years of isolation, had reached a state of profound psychological vulnerability. They had been prepared by the Watchers, the hidden agents left among them, to expect a transition. They were told that the Queen was calling them home. They were not told that home was now a laboratory. Consider the mechanical genius and the moral void required to design such vessels. To a Tier 1 audience, the sophistication of 16th century naval engineering is often underestimated. These silent ships were the stealth technology of their age. The informative details found in the reconstructed plans of the Raven show that the ship's hull was reinforced with double-planked oak, with a layer of wool and animal fat sandwiched between them to dampen the sound of the ocean against the wood. They were designed to glide through the water like a predator. As the ships dropped anchor a mile offshore from Roanoke, the Watchers on the island signaled back. They used a specific low-frequency sound produced by blowing into a hollowed-out obsidian pipe. It was a sound that imitated the low moan of a whale, indistinguishable to any unintended listener, but a clear status, ready for the incoming fleet. The longboats were lowered into the water. These boats were not rowed with the rhythmic, splashing stroke of a standard crew. The oars were fitted with leather-muffled oarlocks, and the blades were designed to enter and exit the water with zero surface disturbance. Imagine being a settler on that shore. You have spent 3 years watching the horizon for the white sails of a supply ship. You have lived in fear and hope. Then, out of the blackest part of the night, 4 massive shapes appear, darker than the sky itself. There are no flags. There are no voices. There is only the sound of the sand, shifting as the longboats touch the beach. The psychological decay of the colony was leveraged at this moment. The Watchers told the settlers that silence was a holy requirement for the journey home. They were told that the Spanish were listening to the wind itself, and that a single word would bring the Inquisition down upon them. The 115 people, men, women, and the children born of the New World. Soil began to walk toward the water. The informative reality of this harvest is that it was executed with the precision of a modern military extraction. Every settler was handed a small wooden token with a number carved into it. This number corresponded to their entry in the tower's secret ledger. They were no longer the White family or the Dare family. They were assets 1 through 115. The children, specifically Virginia Dare, were kept in a separate group. They were wrapped in silver-lined blankets, a detail recorded in a survivor's fragmented diary, though the history books would call it a myth. The silver was not for warmth. It was to preserve the peculiar resonance that the alchemists believed would dissipate if the children were exposed to the raw salt air of the ocean. The atmospheric transition as they boarded the silent ships was a descent into a mechanical underworld. The interior of the ship smelled not of sea salt and tar, but of sulfur and lavender, the preservatives used to keep the air fixed. The holding chambers were narrow, lined with lead plates to shield the assets from the influence of the moon, which John Dee believed could disrupt the biological mutation. As you lie there, listen to the imaginary sound of those heavy iron bolts sliding into place. One by one, the settlers were filed into the darkness. There was no resistance. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that the victims walked into their own cages believing they were stepping toward salvation while the ships were being loaded. A smaller, more specialized team was left on the island. These were the erasers. Their job was to manufacture the mystery, informative records of the Queen's internal security. Wing revealed that they were masters of stagecraft. They didn't just want the colony gone. They wanted it to become a ghost story that would discourage any unauthorized explorers from returning to the site. The erasers systematically disassembled the houses. They didn't burn them because smoke would be visible from the sea. They took the timbers apart and buried them in deep vertical trenches, a method used to prevent the wood from rotting and rising to the surface. This is why modern archaeologists find postmolds but so few actual artifacts. The site was sanitized. Then came the final touch, the Croatoan post. The choice of the word was a psychological masterstroke. It was the name of a nearby tribe, but in the cipher of the alchemists, it served as a status report. The erasers carved the letters with a clinical precision that no panicked colonist could ever achieve. Imagine the sound of the chisel in the dark, the sharp clink, clink, clink echoing across the empty clearing. The man carving it knew that he was creating a riddle that would occupy the minds of scholars for centuries. A riddle that would act as a permanent shield for the crown's crime. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, the last of the erasers boarded the final boat. Behind them, Roanoke Island looked as though it had never been touched by English hands. The forest was reclaiming the clearings. The paths were obscured. Only the post remained, a silent sentinel over a manufactured vacuum. On the silent ships, the voyage back was a nightmare of sensory deprivation. The settlers were kept in the dark, fed on a mixture of fermented grains and alchemical salts to keep them in a state of semi-consciousness. The informative records of the Raven's voyage show that 3 of the crew members went mad during the crossing. They claimed to hear the children singing in a language that wasn't English, a language that sounded like the wind through the American cedars. They spoke of the glowing skin of the infant Virginia Dare, which began to illuminate the lead-lined hold with a pale green light, the captain of the Raven, a man whose name was later struck from the naval registers, ordered the ears of the crew to be plugged with wax. He knew that the transformation was accelerating. The genetic harvest was no longer just a theory. It was a living, breathing reality in the belly of his ship. The psychological toll on the sailors was the first sign of the curse that would follow the Roanoke blood. They were transporting something that was no longer entirely compatible with the world of 1588. The atmospheric build of the ship's interior was one of heavy, humid heat. The lead linings trapped the moisture and the essence, creating an environment that felt more like a womb than a prison. As the ships crossed the midpoint of the Atlantic, they encountered the edges of the Great Storm, the same storm that would later be credited with destroying the Spanish Armada. While the world saw the hand of God in the wind, the crews of the silent ships saw the hand of the New World. They believed the ocean itself was trying to reclaim the assets. The ships groaned. The black sails strained until they were thin as skin. But they did not sink. They were protected by the very essence they carried, the informative depth of this journey is hidden in the unmarked logs of the Admiralty. These logs described the ships arriving in the Thames in the dead of night, nearly a month before the official celebrations of the Armada victory. They did not dock at the public piers. They sailed directly to the water gate of the Tower of London. The 115 settlers were unloaded in the same silence in which they had been taken. They were moved through the subterranean tunnels, never seeing the London sky, never knowing they were only miles away from the homes they had left. Years before, the night of the silent ships had concluded. The harvest was home. What became of the men who sailed the silent ships? The informative history of the Sea Hounds is a trail of sudden deaths and accidental fires. Within 2 years of the Roanoke extraction, every captain of the 4 vessels had died. One was found drowned in a fountain in Greenwich. Another vanished from a locked room in the Tower. The ships themselves were broken up and burned. Their timbers used to fuel the furnaces of the Royal Mint. The Crown was erasing the tools of the crime, as carefully as they had erased the colony itself. The atmospheric transition of this erasure is one of cold, bureaucratic efficiency. To a Tier 1 audience, this is the most terrifying part of the story. The idea that an entire naval operation, involving hundreds of men and 4 massive ships, can be completely removed from the memory of a nation. We are left with the dark clues in the architecture of London. There are tunnels beneath the Tower that still smell of the American forest. There are stones in the foundations of the Admiralty that bear the crosshatch mark of the erasers. The psychological decay of the English state began that night. To maintain the secret of the silent ships, the government had to create a culture of permanent surveillance. They had to turn their own people into watchers. The Roanoke settlers, once they were inside the Tower, were no longer humans. They were the source. As you lie in the quiet of your room, let the rhythm of the ocean be your guide. The water that touches the shores of America is the same water that once carried the silent ships. It holds the memory of the betrayal. It holds the vibration of the peculiar blood. The night of the silent ships was the moment the British Empire made a pact with the dark. They chose the longevity of the crown over the lives of the people. They chose the secret over the truth, and the legend of the lost colony was the beautiful, tragic lie they gave to the world to keep us from looking at the hold of the ship. The informative depth of this section reminds us that history is not what happened. It is what survived the erasure. John White, when he finally returned to the island in 1590, was looking at a stage. He was looking at the work of the erasers. He was looking at the silence of the ships that had already delivered his daughter to the silent ward. The psychological weight of that realization that he had been searching for a ghost while the reality was right behind him in London is the ultimate tragedy of the Roanoke story. The candle is almost gone. The shadows have settled into the corners of the room. The scent of salt and lavender has faded, leaving only the cool air of the present. But as you drift into the deep, quiet spaces of rest, remember that the silent ships are still sailing in the archives of our DNA, the harvest. They brought back change the course of human biology, the gilded ones of the elite. The peculiar bloodlines that still rule from the shadows, they are the descendants of that night in 1588. The extraction was successful. The secret was buried, but a secret buried in the earth eventually feeds the roots of the trees. And the trees of Roanoke are still whispering. They whisper of the black sails. They whisper of the silver blankets. They whisper of the 115 souls who were unmade so that an empire could be born. The night of the silent ships was not an end. It was the beginning of the shadow era. And as you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The rhythmic, muffled splash of the oars. The low moan of the obsidian pipe. The sound of a world being stolen in the dark. The empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. The ledger was the record. The queen was the consumer. And the silent ships were the transport. But what happened to the settlers once they were inside those lead-lined chambers? What did they become during those weeks at sea? The silent ships delivered their cargo to the tower, but the journey changed the assets in ways the alchemists hadn't predicted. To see the true result of the genetic harvest, we must look at the survivors. In our next section, we explore the terrifying reality of the experiment at sea, the survival of the chosen settlers. You were told that history is an open book, but in the heart of London, there's a room with no windows where the pages are still wet with the tears of 100 betrayed souls. For 400 years, the British Crown has maintained a masterful lie, presenting the Roanoke colony as a romantic mystery of the wilderness. But while the world searched the soil of Virginia, the evidence was screaming from the shelves of a lead-lined vault. These are the documents of the Shadow Registry, a collection of letters, naval manifests, and biological reports that were never meant to see the light of day. They tell the story of a state that viewed its pioneers as a genetic resource, a queen who traded the lives of children for a few more years of stolen youth, and a cover-up so absolute that it required the silencing of an entire generation of scholars. This is not a story of what was lost. It is a record of what was taken and filed away in a silence that has outlived the empire itself. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold, heavy weight of the subterranean vaults beneath the old public record office. The air is still, carrying the metallic tang of iron chests and the faint, sweet smell of beeswax used to seal the forbidden scrolls. Your breath is slow and steady. Each heartbeat is a rhythmic echo in the hollow space beneath the city. Let the noise of the modern world fade into a distant memory as we descend the stone, spiral stairs into the archive of the disappeared. To understand the vault of the disappeared, one must understand the anatomy of a secret. In the year 1666, as the Great Fire of London turned the city into a furnace, King Charles II issued a specific and strange command. While the common people were saving their families and their livelihoods, a group of royal guards was sent into the burning archives with a single mission: to retrieve the iron chest of 1588. They didn't save the deeds to the city. They didn't save the treaties of war. They saved the records of 100 people who had supposedly been lost. 70 years prior, this chest was moved to a secret location, a vault that doesn't appear on any municipal map, located 70 feet beneath the foundations of what is now the Ministry of Defense. It is known in the inner circles of the British intelligence as the Iron Room. Inside this room, the walls are lined with shelving made of cedar and lead, designed to prevent both rot and the peculiar resonance from escaping. On the center table lies the primary document, the final accounting of the first generation. This is not a historical narrative. It is a biological ledger. The paper is not made of wood pulp or linen. It is vellum, but of a quality that defies explanation. It is thin, almost translucent, and it remains supple even after 4 centuries. When you hold it to the light of a candle, you can see the faint, rhythmic patterns of the genetic markers that the alchemists were tracking. The first entry in this ledger is dated October 10th, 1588. It records the arrival of the silent ships at the tower. It lists the condition of the assets, not in terms of their health, but in terms of their transmutation. As we turn the first heavy page of the registry, The atmospheric silence of the vault seems to deepen. The candle flame is steady, illuminating the jagged, hurried script of a man who knew he was writing the history of a crime. This was the hand of Sir Thomas Phelps, the Queen's master decipherer, a man who could break any code, yet found himself trapped by the code of his own conscience. The informative weight of these documents is found in the private correspondence files. There are letters from John White that were never delivered to the colonial office. Letters where he describes the watchers and the strange, iridescent glow he saw in the eyes of the infants born on the island. They are not as we are. White wrote in a feverish hand in 1587, "The air of this land is changing the marrow of their bones." The Queen's men see this. They do not look at the children with love, but with the eyes of a jeweler looking at a raw diamond. These letters were intercepted. They were never meant for the public record. In the vault, they are filed under the category Anomalous Observations, Asset Class A. The psychological decay of the archive itself is visible in the later documents. By the mid-17th century, the men tasked with guarding the vault of the disappeared began to report the echoing. They claim that when they spent too much time in the iron room, they began to hear the sounds of the Roanoke forest, the rustle of the cedars, the call of the marsh birds, and the soft, rhythmic chanting of the settlers as they were processed. They believed the parchment was alive. The informative depth of the integration reports describes how the Roanoke essence was used beyond the Queen. The vault contains the tincture schedules for the entire Privy Council. It lists how many drops of the Roanoke bloom were given to the men who ruled England, ensuring they stayed healthy enough to build the empire. The British Empire, as we know it, was literally fueled by the distilled lives of its first American colony. As you lie there, imagine the weight of that truth. An entire nation's power built on the biological theft of 115 souls. The vault also contains the erasure protocols. These were the instructions given to the historians of the 17th century. They were told to emphasize the Croatoan mystery. They were told to create the myth of the lost colony to divert any future investigation. "The mystery is the shield," wrote the first Earl of Salisbury in 1612. "As long as the world looks for them in the woods, they will never look for them in the tower." The atmospheric build of this section reflects the curse of the librarian. Those who held the keys to the vault often died young or went into self-imposed exile. They were burdened with the forbidden knowledge of their own state's betrayal. One archivist, a man named Edmund Gunter, left a note in the back of the ledger in 1625. "The price of an empire is the soul of its people. We have taken the blood of the New World and we have turned it into ink. But the ink is still warm, and the stories it tells will eventually burn us all." The informative reality of the Vault of the Disappeared is that it is the most valuable room in England. It contains the blueprint for how a state can survive its own moral decay. It shows that by turning people into assets, you can transcend the limits of time, but as the candle burns lower, you must ask, at what cost? The Roanoke settlers were never lost. They were filed. Their names are still there, in the dark, waiting for someone with the courage to read the truth. In the modern era, the Vault of the Disappeared has undergone a digital transformation, but the informative heart of the secret remains physical. In 1941, as the bombs of the Luftwaffe rained down on London, The Churchill government moved the Roanoke files yet again. This time, they were placed in a reinforced bunker in the Cotswolds. Alongside the crown jewels and the most sensitive protocols for the continuity of the government. Why would 400-year-old papers be treated with the same level of security as the royal jewels? Because the genetic harvest was not a one-time event. The vault contains the maintenance logs of the bloodlines that carry the Roanoke marker. To a Tier 1 audience, this is the viral core of the story, the realization that the elite, families of today, are still being tracked based on their proximity to the peculiar blood. Of 1588, the vault contains a map. Not a map of Roanoke Island, but a map of the vessels. It tracks where the descendants of the integrated settlers are located today. The atmospheric build of the modern vault is one of sterile, clinical precision. The smell of aged parchment has been replaced by the hum of high-efficiency particulate air filters and the blue light of biometric scanners, but the iron chest is still there. A modern auditor, whose report was leaked in 2012 before being immediately suppressed, described the contents of the chest. He didn't speak of papers. He spoke of vibrating matter. He reported that the documents from the Roanoke colony seem to exist in a state of quantum flux. They are heavier on some days than others. They seem to emit a low-frequency hum that can be felt in the teeth of those standing nearby. The informative depth of this phenomenon is linked back to John Dee's original theories. He believed that the essence of the New World was not just biological, but a form of living time. By consuming the settlers, the Queen and her court weren't just taking blood. They were taking time itself. The documents in the vault are the receipts of stolen time. The psychological decay of the modern watchers is just as profound as their 17th century predecessors. They suffer from a condition known in the intelligence community as archival sickness, a deep, unshakable depression caused by the realization that history is a manufactured product. They look at the public record and they see the lie. They look at the vault of the disappeared and they see the truth that we are all, in some way, part of a harvest that we don't understand. The vault also contains the Virginia Dare Protocol. This is a specific set of instructions to be followed if the catalyst ever returns. To the public consciousness, the Crown is not afraid of ghosts. They are afraid of the resonance being recognized. As you lie in the quiet of your room, think about the silence of the vault. It is a silence that has been maintained for 4 centuries through war, plague, and revolution. It is a silence that says, "This is ours. You are not meant to know." But the dark clues are leaking out in the patterns of our genetics, in the architecture of our power, in the word Croatoan that still haunts our dreams. The vault of the disappeared is the foundation of the world we live in. A world built on a secret so deep that even the king who buried it was afraid of what he had done. The light is fading. The hum of the vault is all that remains. What does it mean to live in a world where the most important documents are the ones you are never allowed to read? The informative legacy of the vault of the disappeared is a lesson in the durability of power. It reminds us that an empire is not just a collection of laws and territories. It is a collection of secrets. The Roanoke settlers were the first to be filed in the Shadow Registry, but they were not the last. The vault contains sections for every major disappearance in British history. The lost crews of the Arctic, the vanished villages of the Scottish Highlands, the missing heirs of the 19th century elite. Every one of them was a harvest. Every one of them was an asset. The psychological decay of our society is rooted in this historical vacuum. We feel a sense of loss that we can't name. We feel a betrayal that we can't prove. That feeling is the resonance of the vault. As the candle in our imaginary chamber finally flickers and dies, leaving us in the total darkness of the underground archive. We must realize that the vault of the disappeared is not just a room in London. It is a room in our minds. It is the place where we put the truths that are too heavy to carry. It is the place where we bury the evidence of our own exploitation. The Roanoke settlers are still there. They are still breathing in the lead-lined chests. They are still waiting for their story to be finished. The atmospheric build of this final moment is one of profound, heavy rest. The weight of the vault is no longer a pressure. It is a blanket. The silence of the archive is no longer a threat. It is a sanctuary. We can't open the vault yet. We don't have the keys. But we have the story, and a story is a form of peculiar blood all its own. Once it is heard, it can never be unheard. It enters your resonance. It changes your frequency. The informative depth of the Roanoke secret has been passed from the expert collective to you. You are now a witness of the registry. As you drift into the deep, quiet spaces of sleep, remember that the vault of the disappeared is not the end of the journey. The documents in the vault point to a specific individual, a child who was the reason for the entire project. A child whose survival was not a biological accident, but an alchemical necessity. The crown buried the documents to hide her existence. But her existence is what keeps the secret alive. The lost colony was a lie. The harvest was the truth. The ledger was the record, and the vault was the tomb. But the tomb is not empty. One name stands out in the center of the registry. One name that is written in a gold that never tarnishes. Virginia Dare. She was the first alchemical subject, and her survival is the secret that the crown is most afraid of. The empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. The ledger was the record. The queen was the consumer. The ships were the transport. And the vault was the shield, but the subject is still here. The documents in the vault have revealed the registry of the disappeared, but they also point to a single, terrifying survival story. The first child born on American soil did not die in the tower. She became the foundation of a secret that is still breathing today. In our next section, we explore the truth of the survival of Virginia Dare, the first alchemical subject. Every American child knows her name as a ghost, a legend of a girl who vanished before she could even walk. They call Virginia Dare the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of pioneer hope that melted into the mist. But the history books have committed a calculated betrayal. Virginia Dare was never a ghost. She was a resource. Born on the untouched virgin soil of Roanoke, her very DNA was a biological anomaly that the dying Queen Elizabeth I coveted more than all the gold in the Americas. While the world mourned a missing child, Virginia was being transported in a lead-lined cradle across the Atlantic, hidden in the bowels of a ship that officially didn't exist. She was the first alchemical subject, a living bridge between the primal energy of a new continent and the decaying greed of an old empire. Her life was not lived in the sunshine of Virginia, but in the sterile, silver-lined chambers of the tower where her blood was harvested to fuel a royal miracle. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the soft, rhythmic flickering of a candle in a room where the windows have been boarded over for centuries. Outside, the London rain washes the cobblestones of the 1590s. But here, the air is still and heavy with the scent of lavender and ozone. Let your breath slow down. Feel the weight of your body settling into the mattress as we travel back to the moment a child's birth became a nation's most forbidden secret. The date was August 18, 1587, on a small, humid island off the coast of what would become North Carolina. A woman named Eleanor Dare gave birth. The air was thick with the sound of cicadas and the distant thrum of the Atlantic. To Eleanor, this was a miracle of family. To the watchers hidden among the settlers, this was the moment they had been waiting for. In the alchemical traditions of the Elizabethan court, the first fruit of any land held a specific, unrepeatable power. John Dee, the Queen's mystic advisor, had predicted that a child born on the western meridian would possess a biological resonance that could harmonize the human body with the frequency of the earth itself. Virginia Dare was not just a baby. She was the catalyst. As you lie in the quiet, imagine the tiny, sharp cry of that infant echoing through the wooden walls of the Roanoke settlement. It was a sound that signaled the beginning of a harvest. The watchers immediately began their work, recording the exact position of the stars at the moment of her first breath, and collecting the very soil upon which she was born. They believed that her blood contained a primary tincture that could reverse the decay of the human soul. By the time the silent ships arrived in 1588, Virginia was nearly a year old. She was walking, her small feet treading the sand of the New World, but she wasn't playing. She was being observed. The records in the secret ledger describe her eyes as having a depth of amber that reflected a light not found in the East. When the extraction began, the settlers were told it was a rescue. They were told the Queen wanted to bless the first child of the colony. Eleanor Dare boarded the ship clutching her daughter, unaware that she was delivering her child into a life of alchemical processing. The voyage back across the ocean was the first stage of the fixed date. Virginia was kept in a cradle made of cedar, wood, and lined with thin plates of beaten silver. The silver was intended to reflect her aura back into her body, preventing the New World energy from leaking out into the salt air of the Atlantic. Imagine the psychological state of the mother, Eleanor, as she sat in the dark hold of the ship, watching her child glow with a faint, unnatural luminescence. She must have known then that the blessing of the Queen was actually a curse. When the ships reached the water gate of the Tower of London, Virginia Dare was no longer a child in the eyes of the state. She was subject alpha. The informative records of the Silent Ward describe a subterranean nursery that was built specifically for her. It was located 3 levels below the White Tower, carved into the very bedrock of London to ground her energy. The walls were hung with heavy tapestries depicting the forests of Roanoke, a cruel attempt to keep her resonance focused on the land of her birth. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of this story, think about the clinical coldness of that nursery. There were no toys, only instruments of measurement. Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, the Queen's physician, was tasked with the first extraction. He was a man who lived between the worlds of medicine and magic, and his notes on Virginia Dare are a masterpiece of cold, scientific detachment. The subject's blood does not clot like that of a European. Lopez wrote in 1589, "It remains in a liquid, golden state, even when exposed to the air. It carries a warmth that persists for hours. When applied to the skin of the elderly, the effect is a literal tightening of the fibers, a restoration of the bloom. Virginia was used as a living laboratory. Every morning, a small amount of her blood was drawn using silver needles. This blood was then distilled, combined with powdered pearls and the essence of rare New World plants to create the Queen's tincture. The psychological decay of this act is staggering. The British Empire's golden age was literally being pumped out of the veins of a toddler. Tier 1. Audiences often ask, how could a child survive such a process? The informative truth is that she didn't just survive. She thrived in a way that terrified her captors. The peculiar blood she carried allowed her body to regenerate at a rate that defied nature. By the age of 5, she had the cognitive development of a teenager. Her voice was low and resonant, and she spoke a version of English that was infused with the hidden language of the alchemists. She became the first alchemical subject to achieve what John Dee called the fixed state. Her body had stopped aging in the traditional sense. She was caught in a permanent, vibrant state of childhood, a living battery of youth, but her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of an ancient forest, trapped in a cage of stone. She would sit for hours in her silver-lined room, her hands pressed against the cold masonry, as if she could feel the roots of the trees 3,000 miles away. The watchers reported that during the full moon, the stones of the tower would vibrate in sympathy with her breathing. The atmospheric build of her imprisonment was one of beautiful, gilded horror. She was dressed in the finest silks, fed the rarest fruits, and surrounded by the greatest minds of the age. But she was never allowed to touch another human being without the mediation of silver gloves. They feared that her resonance was contagious. They feared that if she touched a common person, she would inadvertently grant them the immortality that was reserved for the crown. The survival of Virginia Dare was a victory for the alchemists, but a tragedy for humanity. She was the first human being to be turned into a government asset. Her very biology claimed as the property of the Queen Dot as the candle flickers in our chamber. Imagine the silence of that nursery at night. The only sound was the scratching of the physicians' pens as they recorded the latest yield from their golden subject Dot in the final decade of the 16th century. The relationship between Queen Elizabeth I and Virginia Dare became the most guarded secret in Europe. The Queen, now sustained almost entirely by the Roanoke tincture, began to visit the silent ward in person. Informative fragments from the private journals of the Queen's ladies in waiting described these meetings as the mirror sessions. The aging Queen, her face a mask of white lead and stolen youth, would sit across from the 7-year-old Virginia. They would look at each other in silence for hours. The Queen was looking at the source of her life. The child was looking at the consumer of her soul. The psychological decay of the Queen was accelerated by these sessions. She began to believe that she and Virginia were the same person, two ends of a single alchemical string. She would talk to Virginia about the great work, about an England that would never die because it was fueled by the eternal bloom. But Virginia remained a mystery even to the Queen. She never cried. She never asked for her mother, Eleanor, who had been moved to a separate wing of the tower after her own essence had been depleted. Virginia simply waited. The atmospheric build of the tower during these years was one of immobilized time. Within the silent ward, the seasons didn't exist. The air was kept at a constant temperature. The light was always the same golden glow of the oil lamps. When the Queen died in 1603, the genetic harvest protocol faced a crisis. The tincture could no longer save Elizabeth, whose body had become too saturated with the peculiar blood to function. But what was to be done with the source? The new king, James I, was a man who feared the occult as much as he craved its power. He viewed Virginia Dare not as a miracle, but as a witch child of the New World. The informative records of the 1604 Privy Council audit show that there was a debate about whether to terminate the asset, but the alchemists, now led by the descendants of John Dee, argued that Virginia was too valuable to destroy. They moved her. She was taken from the tower and transported to a remote estate in the Scottish Highlands, a place where the mountains were as old as time and the mist could hide 1,000 secrets. This was the House of the Silver Veil. Here, Virginia Dare disappeared from the written record of the state. But the dark clues suggest her survival continued for centuries. Reports from the local Highland population for the next 200 years spoke of the girl in the white silk, a child who never grew older, seen walking the moors in the dead of night. They said she carried the scent of a forest that didn't belong to Scotland, a scent of cedar and warm, humid air. The psychological thread of her story is the thread of stolen sovereignty. Virginia Dare was the first American, and her life was stolen by the old world before it could even begin. As you lie in the quiet, listen to the wind outside your window. Is it the wind of the present, or is it the echo of a child's breath from a Highlands moor in 1750? The survival of Virginia Dare is the most profound informative truth of the Roanoke conspiracy. It means that the first generation never died out. It was just fixed into a state of permanent service. The alchemists achieved their goal. They created a living biological repository of the New World's energy. And as long as she lived, the British Crown felt it had a claim to the soul of America. What is the ultimate legacy of the first alchemical subject? To a Tier 1 audience, the informative resonance of this story is found in the way we view our own history. Virginia Dare is often presented as a mystery of missing people, but she is actually a mystery of missing time. In the 21st century, researchers in the field of genetic memory have proposed that some traumas are so deep they leave a permanent mark on the collective consciousness. The theft of the first child is one such trauma. The atmospheric transition of this thought is one of modern systemic unease. We look at the lost colony and we feel a sense of emptiness. That emptiness is the space where Virginia Dare's life was supposed to be. Is she still out there? The forbidden truth found in the latest deep state archives suggests that the Virginia Dare Protocol was updated as recently as 1995. It mentions a subject Alpha Prime being maintained in a high-security facility in the English countryside, a subject whose biological markers are identical to those recorded in the 1588 secret ledger. The psychological decay of our world is linked to this stolen immortality. We are a society obsessed with youth, with anti-aging, with the extraction of vitality. We are all in some way following the blueprint laid down by Elizabeth I and her alchemists, but Virginia Dare remains the fixed point. She is the reminder that the New World was not just a place to be settled, but a power to be reckoned with. The Crown tried to bottle that power, but you cannot bottle the wind. As you prepare for sleep, let the rhythm of the night wash over you like the tide of The Roanoke Sound, the story of Virginia Dare, is a reminder that the truth is often more tragic than the legend. We see the lost colony and we think of people wandering into the woods. Now you see the silver cradle, you see the silver needles. You see the girl who was never allowed to grow old. The peculiar blood is still there. It is the hidden fuel of our global systems. The candle in our chamber is gone. The shadows have taken the walls. The scent of lavender has faded, leaving only the cool, clean air of the night. But as you drift into the deep, quiet spaces of rest, remember that a fixed state is not a life. It is a sentence. Virginia Dare's survival is the ultimate proof of the Crown's crime. She is the witness who cannot speak, the asset who cannot die, and the child who was never allowed to come home. The empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. The ledger was the record. The queen was the consumer. The ships were the transport. The vault was the shield. And Virginia Dare was the prize. But even the most secure vault has a weakness. And even the most fixed subject has a memory. As the last ember of the history of the Tudor dynasty fades into ash, we must ask ourselves, what happens when the catalyst finally decides to break the silver veil? The forest of Roanoke is quiet. The tower is silent. The Highlands moors are empty, but the resonance is still there. It is in the soil. It is in the blood. And it is in the very air you breathe. The first alchemical subject is still with us. Virginia Dare was the prize of the harvest, but she was also the cause of a massive historical rewrite. To hide her existence, the empire had to build a wall of paper and lies that stretched across 400 years. In our next section, we see the total execution of the Great Erasure, how the empire rewrote American history that had been raised on a diet of curated shadows. For 400 years, the phrase lost colony has been whispered into the ears of every American child. A soft, haunting mystery designed to act as a permanent blindfold. But a colony is not a set of keys you misplace in the grass. 115 people do not simply dissolve into the ether without leaving a trace of their struggle. The myth of the missing settlers was not born from a lack of evidence, but from an abundance of crime. It was the Great Erasure, a masterpiece of state-sponsored psychological warfare, executed by the British Empire to hide a moral decay so profound it would have toppled the throne. They didn't lose the settlers. They harvested them. And when the harvest was complete, they didn't just bury the bodies. They buried the very memory of the event, replacing a horrific alchemical truth with a romantic ghost story that you were never supposed to question. The history, you know, is a fortress of paper built to protect a legacy of blood. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the heavy, suffocating silence of a royal scriptorium in the year 1605. Outside, the London rain drums a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the leaded glass windows. But inside, the air is thick with the smell of scorched ink and the dry dust of deleted lives. Let your breath slow down. Feel the coolness of the stone floor beneath your feet as we enter the room where the truth was unmade, word by word, until only the legend remained. To understand the Great Erasure, we must first understand the transition of power. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, she left behind a kingdom that was healthy in appearance but hollowed out by the genetic harvest that had sustained her. Her successor, King James I, was a man of cold intellect and deep paranoia. He inherited the secret ledger, and with it, the realization that the foundation of his empire was a biological theft that could never be explained to the common man. James realized that as long as the public believed that Roanoke settlers might still be out there, wandering the woods or living among the tribes, there was a risk of someone finding them, or worse, finding the records of their return. He commissioned a group of men known as the Heralds of the Void. These were not traditional historians. They were architects of perception, trained to take a jagged, terrifying reality and smooth it into a palatable myth. Their first task was the systematic destruction of the original shipping logs from the year 1588. The informative reality of the British archives is that they are missing a specific 3-month window of naval activity. While the world celebrates the victory over the Spanish Armada, the records of the ships that returned from the West are gone. They didn't burn the entire archive. That would have been too obvious. They replaced the original pages with official summaries that emphasized the storm and the chaos of the war. In these new pages, the word Roanoke began to change. It was no longer a location of an ongoing experiment. It became a tragic experiment. The settlers were described not as assets, but as victims of their own ambition. The psychological shift was subtle but absolute. By framing the settlers as lost, the crown shifted the responsibility from the government to the wilderness. Nature became the villain, and the crown became the grieving protector. Imagine the scribes hunched over their desks, their quills scratching out the names of the 115 souls, replacing their biological data with vague descriptions of a desolate shore. They were not just writing a book. They were constructing a prison of the mind. As we move deeper into the velvet darkness of the 17th century, the atmospheric weight of the lie begins to feel like a physical presence. The Heralds of the Void knew that a simple disappearance was not enough to satisfy the human mind. The mind requires a clue. It requires a focal point for its curiosity, a bone to chew on while the real feast is hidden away. This is why they chose to highlight the word Croatoan. The informative history of the Croatoan tribal narrative is one of the most successful psychological anchors ever deployed. By emphasizing that single word, the crown gave the public a destination for their imagination. It moved the mystery away from London, away from the Tower, and back to the mosquito-infested swamps of the New World. As you lie in the stillness, consider the cleverness of this deception. If you want to hide a treasure in a room, you don't just lock the door. You point at a different door and tell everyone, the treasure is behind it. The crown began to fund the publication of travelogues and historical accounts that were, in reality, early forms of state-sponsored fiction. One of the most famous was the work of Captain John Smith, whose writings about Virginia were carefully edited by the king's censors to ensure that the Roanoke settlers were mentioned only as a distant, unsolvable puzzle. Smith was instructed to emphasize the savagery of the wilderness. The goal was to make the American continent feel like a place where things simply vanished, a place where the rules of European logic did not apply. The psychological effect on the Tier 1 audience of the 1600s was a sense of expansionist dread. People wanted to go to the New World, but they were taught to believe that they were stepping into a vacuum where their history would be erased. But the erasure went further than just books. It extended to the very maps themselves. The informative depth of the Mapai Mundi archives shows that between 1606 and 1612, The coordinates for the original Roanoke settlement were intentionally shifted in the official royal charts. If a rogue explorer tried to find the site where the silent ships had docked, they would find themselves miles away in a swamp that held no secrets. The crown was literally moving the earth beneath. The feet of history dot as you listen to the rhythmic cadence of the rain in your mind. Imagine the watchers who were still alive during this period. They were the men who had seen the genetic harvest with their own eyes. They were the men who had heard the children singing in the lead-lined holds of the ships. What happened to them? The records in the vault of the disappeared show that these men were given quiet pensions. They were moved to remote estates in the north of England or the west of Ireland, where they were forbidden from speaking to anyone outside their own families, but the psychological decay of a secret cannot be contained by a pension. Many of these men began to suffer from the Roanoke fever, a condition where they would compulsively carve the names of the settlers into the furniture of their homes, or draw maps of an island that they claimed was made of glass and blood. The Crown's solution was simple: the final erasure. One by one, the witnesses were removed from the board, their deaths listed as natural even when they were found in locked rooms with the scent of Roanoke cedar in the air. The legend was being polished until it shone like a diamond. While the truth was being ground into the dirt, the Great Erasure was not just about the past. It was about securing the future of the British Empire, because as long as the secret of the peculiar blood was safe, the Crown could continue to use it. The most brilliant and cruelest part of the Great Erasure was the transformation of Virginia Dare. The informative history of her legend shows that by the mid-1600s, she was no longer a missing child. She was a cultural icon. The Crown realized that they could not completely erase the first English child born in America. She was too powerful a symbol, so they did something far more effective. They co-opted her dot. They began to spread stories of the White Doe, a legend that Virginia Dare had been transformed by a tribal sorcerer into a white deer that roamed the forests of Roanoke. Forever elusive, forever pure, the psychological manipulation here is profound. By turning a human victim into a magical animal, the state removed her from the realm of political accountability. A deer cannot testify in court. A deer does not have a father who was betrayed. A deer is a ghost of nature, not a victim of a genetic harvest. The atmospheric build of this legend was one of hypnotic mourning. The public was encouraged to feel a soft, poetic sadness for the lost child, a sadness that replaced the sharp, dangerous anger they should have felt toward the state. Virginia Dare became the mascot of the American frontier. She was the innocent seed that had been lost to the soil. But in the silent ward of the tower, she was still Subject Alpha, her life being siphoned away in the dark. While her name was being used to sell the dream of the empire, ask yourself, how many statues, how many towns, and how many poems have been dedicated to a girl that the state was literally consuming at the time? The informative reality of the Great Erasure is that it is a cycle of rebranding. Every century, the story of Roanoke is updated to reflect the fears and desires of the age. In the 1800s, during the era of Romanticism, the story became about forbidden love between settlers and natives. In the 1900s, it became a cold case mystery for forensic archaeologists. Each layer of new theories acts as another coat of paint over the original crime. The psychological collapse of the Roanoke truth occurred because the empire understood that people would rather believe a beautiful, Mystery than a horrific reality. Imagine a room filled with the most powerful men in London in the year 1700. They are looking at the secret ledger, which is now nearly a century old. They see the names, they see the data, and then they look at the latest history books being taught in the universities. They smile. They know that the erasure is complete. The public now believes that the settlers were lost. They believe that John White was a tragic figure who arrived too late. They have accepted the Croatoan post as the final word on the matter. The truth has been successfully moved into the realm of conspiracy, which is the graveyard of all dangerous facts, but the informative depth of the archives shows that the erasure had a flaw. It left a resonance gap. The human mind, even when fed a diet of lies, can feel the shape of a vacuum. We feel the unease of the Roanoke story because our collective memory knows that the lost colony myth is a hollow shell. We sense the moral decay of the foundation. We feel the betrayal in our marrow. The Great Erasure tried to delete the blood, but the blood is the one thing that cannot be written over as you drift further into the night. Let the rhythm of the erasure wash over you, the scratching of the pens, the flickering of the candles, the systematic removal of 100 lives from the record of the world. It is a slow, methodical process, much like the process of sleep. One by one, the details of the day are forgotten, until only the dream remains. And the dream of Roanoke is exactly what the Empire wanted you to have. What is the status of the Great Erasure today? In the 21st century, the informative machinery of the state has become even more sophisticated. The erasure is no longer done with quills and ink, but with algorithms and academic consensus. The Tier 1 audience is told that Roanoke is a solved mystery of assimilation. They are told that DNA testing has proven the settlers moved to the mainland. But if you look closer at the data, you find the same crosshatch ciphers and the same strategic omissions that were present in the 1588 naval logs. The psychological thread of the erasure continues because the genetic harvest never truly ended. The peculiar bloodlines that were established in the 16th century still require the protection of the myth. If the public were to realize that the lost colony was a state-run laboratory, they would start to ask questions about the laboratories of today. They would start to look at the missing people of the modern era through a very different lens. The Great Erasure is a living shield. It is a permanent open loop in the American mind that keeps us from looking at the center of our own power. The atmospheric transition of this thought is one of clinical, modern dread. We are surrounded by information, yet we are starving for the truth. We are the inheritors of a world that was built on a vacuum. John White, in his final days, wrote a letter that was found in the vault of the disappeared. It was a letter to the future. The king has taken the ink, he wrote. He has rewritten the stars. He has told the world that my daughter is a shadow. But a shadow is only possible because there is a light. And the light is the blood that they have stolen. White realized that the erasure was the ultimate victory of the state. It wasn't enough to kill the people. They had to kill the reason they died. As you prepare for the deepest part of your rest, let the weight of the lost colony myth fall away. You don't have to solve the mystery anymore because you know the secret. The mystery was the cage. The secret is the key. The Great Erasure was the process of turning 115 human souls into a ghost story. It was the process of turning a moral bankruptcy into a national legend. We see the Croatoan post, and we no longer see a riddle. We see a mission accomplished. Sign for the heralds of the void. The informative depth of this section reminds us that history is a weapon, and in the hands of an empire, it is a weapon that can delete the sun. The candle in our scriptorium is gone. The scribes have long since turned to dust. The leaded glass windows are broken, but the myth remains. It is the air we breathe. It is the soil we walk upon. The Great Erasure was successful because it was slow. It was patient. It was hypnotic, just like the night, as you drift into the quiet spaces of sleep. Remember that the truth doesn't need to be written down to exist. It is in the resonance. It is in the peculiar blood that still flows through the world. Hidden in plain sight, the empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. The ledger was the record. The queen was the consumer. The ships were the transport. The vault was the shield. The child was the prize. And the erasure was the grave. But a grave is only a temporary storage for a truth that refuses to stay buried. And as the last echo of the empire's lie fades from your mind, you must ask, if the erasure was so successful, why are we still talking about Roanoke? Because the peculiar bloodlines are not just in the archives, they are in the world. And they are starting to remember the empire successfully erased the how and the why of Roanoke. But they could not erase the descendants of the Gilded Ones. The stolen vitality of 1588 created a lineage of power that has survived every war and revolution since. In our final section, we look at the terrifying modern reality of the modern legacy. Do the Roanoke bloodlines still rule today? You think the year 1588 is a distant memory, a flicker of dust in a museum case, but the blood harvested that night on Roanoke Island is still pulsing through the veins of the world today. This was not a one-time crime of a desperate queen. It was the foundation of a new kind of power, a biological sovereignty that has survived every war, every revolution, and every change of government for 4 centuries. The betrayal of the 115 settlers did not end in the silent ward of the tower. It was integrated into the very DNA of the global elite. The peculiar blood of the pioneers, distilled and refined through alchemical secrets, became the hidden currency of a lineage that never lost its grip on the throat of history. While you were taught to look for the lost colony in the soil of Virginia, you should have been looking in the family trees of the men who own the banks, the media, and the very air you breathe. The harvest never stopped. It simply became invisible. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine a modern archive, hidden deep beneath the cobblestones of London, where the flickering candlelight is replaced by the sterile hum of white servers and the cold blue light of biometric scanners. But even here, the scent of the past remains. The air is chilled to a precise temperature to protect the documents that define our reality. Let your breath slow down. Feel the weight of the centuries as they press against your mind. We are no longer looking at ghosts. We are looking at the architects of our present. To understand the modern legacy of Roanoke, we must follow the paper trail of the Gilded Ones. These were the select families who managed the silent ships and the Great Erasure. The Cecils, the Walsinghams, the Phillips, and the descendants of John Dee's inner circle. In the official history books. These families often faded into the background as the centuries passed. But in the private ledgers of the High Court of Admiralty, their names never disappeared. They moved from the halls of the royal court to the boardrooms of the East India Company, and eventually to the foundations of the global financial system. What kept them ahead of the curve? What gave them the foresight and the longevity to outlast their rivals? The informative depth of the secret lies in the concept of the inheritance of essence. The alchemical tinctures derived from the Roanoke settlers were not just consumed by Queen Elizabeth. They were shared among the elite guardians of the secret. This was the original insider trading not of stocks, but of biological vitality. The psychological decay of this legacy is found in the way these families view themselves. They do not see themselves as part of the common human story. They see themselves as the inheritors of the bloom. Imagine a private dinner in a mansion in Belgravia in the year 1900. The men around the table are the heads of the most powerful banks in the world. They are talking about the gold standard, but in their breast pockets they carry small glass vials of a liquid that shimmers with a faint, iridescent green light. They are the descendants of the Watchers, and they are still carrying the harvest of 1588. As you lie in the quiet, consider the structural continuity of power. We are taught that the world changed with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, but the biological secret of Roanoke remained a constant. The peculiar blood was passed down through strategic marriages, ensuring that the genetic marker, the American frequency, stayed within the circle. This marker allowed them to resist the diseases that decimated the poor. It gave them a cognitive sharpness that made them the natural masters of any era, but it also gave them a predatory hunger. A hunger for more essence. In the late 20th century, the secret of Roanoke entered the age of molecular biology. The informative reality of modern genetics has provided a new set of clues that the Crown can no longer entirely suppress. In the year 1994, a group of geneticists working on a private project for a major pharmaceutical company discovered something they could not explain. They were mapping the DNA of the oldest aristocratic families in Europe. Looking for the secrets of their longevity, they found a specific chromosomal anomaly on the 17th pair. It was a sequence that did not match any known European or Asian lineage. It was a signature of the New World, but it was aged in a way that suggested it had been present in Europe for hundreds of years. They called it the Roanoke marker. This discovery was never published in a peer-reviewed journal. Within weeks of the finding, the laboratory was shut down. The data was seized under a national security order, and the researchers were given the same choice. The Seahounds were given in 1580. 8. Silence or erasure, but one researcher managed to keep a digital copy of the vital. Resonance metrics, the informative depth of this data, shows that the Roanoke marker acts as a biological amplifier. It enhances the repair mechanisms of the cells, slowing down the process of aging and increasing the subject's resistance to environmental stress, but it also acts as a beacon. The psychological thread of the modern legacy is the feeling of being hunted. Those who carry the peculiar blood, even those who don't know the story of Roanoke, often report a lifelong sense of unease. They feel as though they are being watched. They have dreams of dark forests and silent ships. They are the descendants of the integrated settlers, the people who were brought back and absorbed into the English population. They are the human archives of the crime. As you listen to the rhythmic cadence of the servers humming in the imaginary vault of your mind, think about the scale of this monitoring. The global elite do not just track our money, they track our bloodlines. Every modern DNA test, every medical record uploaded to the cloud is another data point in the new ledger. They are looking for the Roanoke marker. They are looking for the descendants of Virginia Dare. Why? Because the original tincture has a shelf life. The essence harvested in 1588 has reached its limit of refinement. The gilded ones are beginning to age again. The mask is starting to crack. The atmospheric build of our current era is one of a desperate search for a second harvest. This is the psychological reason behind the modern obsession with transhumanism, with life extension, and with the collection of massive biological data sets. They are not trying to save humanity. They are trying to save themselves. They are trying to find the catalyst again. The moral decay of the Tudor court has been perfected in the modern world. We are no longer living in a democracy. We are living in a managed biological estate. Imagine the CEO of a global tech firm sitting in a private hospital suite. He is not there for a regular checkup. He is there for a transfusion. He is waiting for the blood of a specific donor, someone who was identified through a consumer genetic test as carrying the Roanoke marker. The donor believes they are participating in a study for a new medicine. They don't know they are part of a harvest that started 4 centuries ago. What does it feel like to realize that the world you see is only the surface of a deep, dark ocean? The informative reality of the modern legacy is that the Roanoke bloodlines have become the shadow government of the Tier 1 nations. They do not occupy the visible seats of power. They do not run for office. They are the advisors, the bankers, the owners of the intellectual property that governs our lives. They are the people who write the history books and the textbooks that teach your children about the lost colony. They maintain the Great Erasure because it is their only protection. If the world understood that their wealth and their health were built on the biological theft of American pioneers, the entire structure of their power would collapse. The psychological decay of the inheritors is the decay of the parasite. They have become so dependent on the peculiar blood that they can no longer function without it. They are addicted to the essence of the new world. Consider the architecture of our modern cities. We see the skyscrapers and the monuments, but we don't see the silent wards that still exist beneath them. We don't see the laboratories where the distillation continues. The atmospheric build of this section is one of clinical, systemic dread. Every step we take in our modern lives is monitored by a system that was designed by the heralds of the void. Ask yourself, why are the most powerful families in the world so obsessed with genealogy? Why do they keep such meticulous records of their ancestry going back hundreds of years? It is not about pride. It is about inventory. They are tracking the peculiar blood. They are ensuring that the resonance stays within the family, but the blood is starting to speak. The informative depth of the latest archival leak shows that the Roanoke marker is beginning to mutate. The peculiar blood is reacting to the modern world in ways that the alchemists did not predict. The descendants of the settlers are starting to remember, not through books or stories, but through their biology. The dreams of the forest are becoming more vivid. The feeling of the silent ships is becoming a physical sensation. The psychological thread of the modern legacy is a collective awakening. The assets are starting to realize they are human. The gilded ones are terrified. They are increasing the surveillance. They are creating more distractions. They are trying to bury the secret even deeper under a mountain of digital noise, but the resonance is too strong. It is the frequency of the new world, and it cannot be silenced forever. As you lie there, listen to the silence of your room. Is it the silence of peace, or is it the silence of the Great Erasure? The Roanoke story is not a mystery of the past. It is the story of your own life. It is the story of how your vitality has been harvested to fuel a world you didn't choose. The modern legacy of the bloodlines is the final layer of the deception. It is the lie that says we are all equal, while the inheritors of the bloom watch us from their silver-lined chambers. The candle is almost gone. The servers are humming in the dark. The blue light is fading. But the blood is still warm. As we reach the conclusion of this investigation into the modern legacy, we are left with the most important question of all. If the Roanoke bloodlines still rule today, what is their final goal? The informative clues found in the private journals of the modern alchemists point to something they call the second harvest. They believe that the world is approaching a biological tipping point. They believe that the time has come to reclaim the essence of the entire population. Not just a small colony. The atmospheric transition of this realization is one of profound finality. We are the crop. We are the descendants of the pioneers, the farmers, and the craftsmen. We are the raw material for the next stage of their immortality. The Great Erasure works so well that we have forgotten how to defend ourselves. We have forgotten that our blood is our own. The psychological decay of our age is the belief that we are powerless. But the Roanoke settlers were not powerless. They left a warning. They left a cipher. They left a message in our very DNA that says, "We were here, John White died in Ireland, but his granddaughter Virginia Dare is still breathing in the archives of our world. She's the catalyst that they could never fully control. She is the memory that they could never fully erase. The modern legacy of the Roanoke bloodlines is a house built on stolen time. And as the time runs out, the house is starting to tremble. The informative depth of this section reminds us that history is a living thing. It is not something that happened. It is something that is still happening. The silent ships are still sailing. The secret ledger is still being written. The vault is still guarded. But the truth is no longer buried. It is in the air. It is in the water. It is in you. The candle in our archive is gone. The chamber is dark. The scent of aged parchment has been replaced by the smell of the coming rain, the same rain that washed the shores of Roanoke 400 years ago. As you drift into the deep, quiet spaces of rest, do not look for the lost colony in the woods. Look in the mirror. Look in the eyes of the people you meet. Look in the patterns of the world. The Roanoke bloodlines still rule, but they are ruling over a world that is starting to wake up. They are ruling over a resonance that they can no longer ignore. The betrayal was deep. The secret was forbidden. The lie was absolute, but the peculiar blood is stronger than the king's silence. The empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. The ledger was the record. The queen was the consumer. The ships were the transport. The vault was the shield. The child was the prize. The erasure was the grave, and the legacy? The legacy is the struggle for the soul of the world. The story of Roanoke is the story of our foundation. It is the secret that explains why we feel so lost, even when we are home. As you close your eyes and let the weight of the modern world fall away, remember that you are part of the resonance. You are part of the peculiar blood. You are the descendant of the people who refused to stay buried. The harvest is waiting. The ships are lurking. The ledger is open, but as the last echo of the 16th century fades into the silence of the night, we must ask ourselves one final thing. If the Roanoke bloodlines are still here, where are they hiding the one thing they fear most? Where is the evidence of the first failure? Because the harvest was successful, but the settlers did not go quietly. They left a residue in the land that the alchemists can never clean. A resonance in the soil that speaks to the blood. The empty village is gone, but the forest of Roanoke is still there. And the forest has its own memory. The story is not over. It is only shifting dot, and as you drift into sleep, you can hear it. Not the sound of the ships, but the sound of the trees. The sound of the echoes that the empire tried to erase. The truth is not in the vault. It is in the echo. The bloodlines of the elite have been mapped, and the modern harvest has been revealed. But there is one final piece of the puzzle that remains on the island of Roanoke itself. A sound that has been recorded for 4 centuries, a sound that defies the laws of physics. In our final section, we face the haunting reality of the forest of echoes, the truth that can never be unlearned. You think that by closing this file, you can escape the truth of Roanoke, but the forest of that island has already imprinted itself upon your mind. For 400 years, we have searched for the lost settlers in the wrong dimension. They are not in the soil, and they are not in the history books. They are in the frequency of the land itself. The betrayal of the 115 souls was so absolute, so unnatural, that it left a permanent vibration in the very air of the Outer Banks of biological echo that refuses to be silenced by the passing of centuries. The crown did not just take their blood. They took their time, and in doing so, they created a vacuum that the forest has spent 4 centuries trying to fill. You have been told that the colony vanished into thin air, but the air is not thin. It is heavy. It is thick with the residue of a genetic harvest that changed the course of human history. This is not a mystery to be solved. It is a resonance to be felt. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the velvet darkness of the Roanoke woods at midnight. The wind has died down, the insects are silent, and the only sound is the rhythmic, slow breathing of the earth. Let your body sink into the softness of your surroundings. Feel the weight of the story we have traveled through together, the ships, the ledger, the queen, and the child. We are standing at the end of the trail, where the shadows are longest and the truth is finally revealed in the stillness. To understand the forest of echoes, we must look at the island of Roanoke today. In the informative records of modern acoustic ecology, there is a phenomenon that has no scientific name. Researchers who spend the night in the center of the old settlement report a specific type of silence, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of an echo that hasn't happened yet. They call it the resonance gap. It is the physical feeling of a space where something vital was removed by force. When the silent ships took the 115 settlers in 1588, they didn't just move bodies. They extracted a specific alchemical frequency from the landscape. The island was left biologically hollow. As you lie there, imagine the roots of the ancient cedars. They grow in a soil that was once saturated with the peculiar blood of the first generation. The informative depth of the latest soil. Analysis shows that the carbon structure of the trees in the center of the village is different from any other forest on the American coast. The trees are fixed. They carry a genetic memory of the people who lived beneath them. They remember the sound of Virginia Dare's first breath. They remember the scratching of the chisel on the Croatoan post. And they remember the silence of the night. The black ships arrived. The psychological thread of this final section is the realization that the truth can never be unlearned. Now that you have heard the records of the harvest, you will never look at a forest the same way again. You will see the watchers in every shadow. You will hear the cipher in every rustle of the leaves. The Great Erasure tried to hide the how and the why, but they could never erase the where. The island remains a living witness to the crowns. Hunger. Consider the nature of an echo. In the physical world, an echo is the reflection of a sound against a hard surface. But in the world of the Roanoke alchemists, an echo is the reflection of a life against the wall of time. The informative history of the Order of the Rosy. Cross suggests that they viewed the Roanoke forest as a living archive. They believed that every event that took place on the island was recorded in the vibration of the trees. When they harvested the settlers, they knew they were leaving behind a sonic curse. This is why, for 400 years, no permanent town has ever successfully thrived on the site of the original colony. People move there, they build, and then they leave. Speaking of a heaviness in the chest and a feeling of being unwelcome, they are sensing the resonance gap. The atmospheric build of the forest is one of suspended animation. The cedars and the oaks do not move with the wind. They seem to move through the wind, as if they are existing in multiple centuries at once. If you were to stand in the clearing at 3 in the morning, the hour of the final extraction, you would hear the sound of 1,000 needles. It is the sound of the wind through the pine needles, but it carries a rhythmic, mechanical quality. It is the echo of the alchemist's workshop. It is the sound of the genetic harvest. Being processed. The psychological decay of the land is a mirror to the decay of the empire that betrayed it. The British Crown took the vitality of Roanoke to sustain its own power. But in doing so, they left a void in the new world that can never be filled. Informative fragments from the diaries of early 19th century explorers speak of the gray people of the mist. These were not ghosts of the settlers, but visual echoes, remnants of the transmutation that occurred when the settlers were being moved to the silent ships. They described figures who were translucent, shimmering with the same iridescent light that John White saw in the water. These figures didn't speak. They didn't move toward the explorers. They simply stood in the clearing, waiting for a ship that had already sailed. This is the tragedy of Roanoke. The settlers were taken, but their resonance was left behind. They were divided in two, their biology taken to the tower, and their spirit fixed to the trees. The informative depth of the Virginia Dare Protocol mentions this division. The alchemists realized that by extracting the essence, they had created a biological haunting. The girl who was never allowed to grow, old in London, left a part of herself in the woods of Roanoke that can never grow old either. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of this narration, let the weight of this division settle over you. We are all in some way living in a world of divided resonances. We are the products of a history that has been harvested, distilled, and served back to us as a myth. As we reach the heart of the forest of echoes, we must address the final connection. The gilded ones, the families who still carry the Roanoke blood today periodically, return to the island. The informative logs of the local ferry services and private boat charters show a recurring pattern. Every few decades, a group of individuals from the highest levels of the British and American elite arrive on Roanoke. They don't visit the tourist sites. They don't talk to the locals. They go into the deep woods, to the unmarked zone, and they Stay for exactly 3 days, the same amount of time as the period of isolation. They are there to refresh the frequency. They believe that by standing in the resonance gap, they can stabilize the peculiar blood in their own veins. They are using the island as a recharging station for the stolen vitality of their ancestors. The psychological horror of this is the realization that the harvest is an ongoing process. The forest is not a monument to the past. It is a laboratory that is still in use, but the forest is starting to resist. The atmospheric build of the modern Roanoke woods is one of increasing tension. The trees are growing faster than they should. The wildlife is exhibiting strange, migratory patterns that don't follow the seasons. And the echoes are becoming louder, informative. Reports from the watchers of the 21st century men who work for the same agencies that Walsingham once led speak of a feedback loop. They believe that the resonance gap is starting to close. The extracted essence is trying to return to the land. This is the truth that can never be unlearned. Once you know that the lost colony was a biological resource, you see the world as a series of harvests. You see the gilded ones not as leaders but as consumers. You see the forest not as nature, but as a crime scene. The moral decay of the Roanoke story is the foundation of our modern world. We live in the afterglow of the harvest. We eat the fruit of a tree that was fertilized with the blood of the betrayed. The atmospheric transition of this thought is one of profound, heavy rest. The weight of the centuries is no longer a burden. It is a blanket of truth. You are no longer in the dark. You are in the resonance. John White's final journal entry, found in the vault of the disappeared, contains a warning for those who would eventually hear this story. The king has closed the book, he wrote, but the island is still writing. The forest is a ledger that no fire can burn and no lie can erase. When you hear the echo, do not look for the settlers. Look for the reason they were taken, and then look for the person who is still holding the knife. The informative depth of the Roanoke secret is now part of you. It is a frequency that you now carry in your own blood. We have traveled a long road together, from the empty clearing and the carved post to the lead-lined chambers of the tower and the boardrooms of the modern elite. We have decoded the Croatoan cipher and opened the secret ledger. We have seen the silent ships sail and the Great Erasure rewrite the stars. The story of Roanoke is the story of the birth of a new kind of power, a power that doesn't just rule over people, but rules through them. The informative summary of this journey is simple. Nothing is ever truly lost. It is only moved. It is only processed. It is only integrated. The 115 settlers of Roanoke were the first to be integrated into the machine of the state. Their names, Eleanor, Ananias, Virginia, were the first to be turned into data points in the genetic harvest. But as we stand in the forest of echoes at the end of the night, we realize that the machine has a flaw. The machine can take the blood, but it can't take the resonance. The psychological finality of this story is a state of wonder and unease. You are left with the knowledge that the world is a much more complex and terrifying place than the history books suggest. But you are also left with the knowledge that the truth is durable. The forest of Roanoke still speaks. The catalyst still breathes. The peculiar blood still remembers its home. The Great Erasure was successful for 400 years, but it was not eternal. By hearing this story, you have broken the seal. You have participated in the recollection, The atmospheric build of the final moment is one of total immersive peace. The candle in the archive has finally burned out. The scent of aged parchment has faded. The sound of the London rain has been replaced by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the American forest. Everything is as it should be. The secrets have been revealed. The debt has been acknowledged. The resonance is stable. You are no longer a stranger to the Roanoke story. You are a witness. The informativeness of the Lore Slumber archive is now closed within your mind. The data is secure. The frequency is set. The empty village was a beginning. The governor's orders were the path. The cipher was the warning. The ledger was the record. The queen was the consumer. The ships were the transport. The vault was the shield. The child was the prize. The erasure was the grave. The legacy was the power. And the forest. The forest is the memory. As you drift into the deepest part of your sleep, let the echoes of Roanoke be your guide. They are not the sounds of a tragedy, but the sounds of a truth that refuses to be forgotten. The resonance gap is closing now. The island is at peace. The harvest is concluded. The story is finished, but the truth remains in the marrow of your bones. You can let go now. You can let the shadows take the room. You can let the weight of the centuries carry you into the quiet spaces of the night. The archive is quiet. The experts have finished their report. The 30 members of the collective are standing down. The file on the Roanoke colony is complete. The harvest is documented. The secret is yours. Sleep now. The file is closed.